Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of England's most troubled reigns, the story of Edward II, whose weakness and poor choices led to betrayal, deposition, and a mysterious end that still haunts historians today. We'll softly explore the disastrous 20-year reign of a king who preferred the company of male favourites over the duties of rulership, whose devotion to Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger would tear his kingdom apart. From his troubled relationship with his formidable father Edward I, to his passionate but destructive friendships, to the ultimate betrayal by his French Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, all while the kingdom crumbled around him. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying these gentle historical tales. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Perhaps you could share which historical figure you'd like to hear about next, or simply let me know how these stories help you drift off to sleep. Don't be shy. Our Sleepy Crown family is wonderfully welcoming. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to keep these soothing historical journeys coming your way. So cozy up under your blanket, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from medieval England lull you into restful sleep. Tonight, we witness the fall of a king who had everything, yet lost it all through his own failings and the ruthless ambitions of those closest to him. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Edward, later known as Edward II of England, entered this world on April the 25th, 1284, beneath the ancient stone walls of Caernarfon Castle in North Wales. His birth came at a moment heavy with symbolism and foreboding. Less than a year after his father, the mighty Edward I, had conquered the Welsh princes and claimed their ancestral lands for the English crown. The castle, where young Edward drew his first breath, was no accident of location. Edward I, known to history as Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots, had deliberately chosen this sacred Welsh site for his son's arrival. Caernarfon held deep meaning for the Welsh people, connected as it was to their legends of Roman emperors and ancient kings. By having his heir born within these walls, Edward I sought to bind the conquered Welsh to his growing empire, presenting them with a prince born on their own soil. Yet even as the infant's cries echoed through the castle chambers, fate was already weaving a darker thread into the tapestry of his life. That same year, 1284, marked the death of Edward's elder brother Alfonso, the prince who had been destined for the throne. With Alfonso's passing, the newborn Edward suddenly found himself heir to one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, a responsibility he had never been meant to bear. The child born that spring day would grow up under the shadow of impossible expectations. His father, Edward I, stood as one of medieval England's most formidable monarchs. Tall, commanding, and utterly ruthless when necessity demanded, Edward I had spent his reign expanding English power across the British Isles. He had crushed rebellions in Wales, imposed his will upon Scotland, and maintained England's hold on its valuable territories in France. Contemporary chroniclers described Edward I with a mixture of awe and fear. One called him a king to inspire fear and respect, while another characterized him more bluntly as an efficient bully. Whatever the precise nature of his methods, none could dispute their effectiveness. Under his rule, England had grown wealthy and powerful, though the cost in blood and treasure had been enormous. Into this world of conquest and constant warfare, young Edward II was born with a nature seemingly designed to disappoint his father's expectations. where Edward I was tall and imposing, his son would grow to average height. Where the father thrived on military campaigns and the harsh business of medieval kingship, the son showed early preferences for gentler pursuits that raised eyebrows among the court nobility. The infant Edward's early years were spent largely in the care of wet nurses and household servants, as was customary for royal children. His mother, Eleanor of Castile, was often absent on campaign with her husband, leaving their youngest son to form his earliest bonds with the domestic staff who tended to his daily needs. This early separation from his parents may have contributed to the intense, almost desperate need for close companionship that would characterize Edward's entire life. As a child, Edward displayed interests that marked him as different from the typical royal heir. While other young nobles learned the arts of war and governance, Edward seemed drawn to music, poetry, and even manual crafts, pursuits considered beneath a future king's dignity. He showed particular fascination with the newly invented Welsh instrument called the crwth, and enjoyed listening to the complex harmonies of Welsh musical traditions. Perhaps most unusually for a prince destined to lead armies, Edward appeared to have little natural aptitude for or interest in the martial arts that formed the foundation of medieval noble education. Where his father had excelled at swordplay, horsemanship, and military strategy from an early age, young Edward seemed more content with quieter activities that allowed him to avoid the physical confrontations that thrilled other boys of his station. The Dominican friars who supervised much of Edward's formal education found in him a thoughtful student, though one whose mind seemed to wander towards subjects far removed from the practical concerns of rulership. He learned to read and write competently, unusual accomplishments for the time, and showed genuine appreciation for the theological and philosophical texts that formed the backbone of medieval learning. Yet even as his tutors praised his gentle disposition and quick intelligence, whispers began to circulate about the young prince's suitability for the throne he would one day inherit. Court observers noted his preference for the company of servants and commoners over the great nobles who would someday be his subjects. They remarked on his enjoyment of physical labor, rowing boats, tending gardens, engaging in the simple crafts that nobles typically left to their inferiors. These early signs of Edward's unconventional nature would have been concerning enough in any royal heir, but they took on added significance given the turbulent times in which he lived. England in the late 13th century faced threats on multiple fronts. The conquered Welsh remained restless under English rule, ready to rise again at the first sign of weakness. Scotland, though temporarily subdued, harboured deep resentment against English overlordship and awaited its chance for revenge. Most pressingly, England's ongoing conflicts had drained the royal treasury nearly dry. Edward I's continuous campaigns required enormous sums of money, forcing him to impose ever heavier taxes on his subjects and to borrow extensively from Italian banking houses. By the time of young Edward's birth, the crown's debts had reached the staggering sum of £200,000, a burden that would pass to his son along with the throne itself. The prophecies surrounding Edward's birth added another layer of mystique and expectation to his early years. Medieval chroniclers, ever eager to find divine significance in royal births, declared that the prince's arrival marked the fulfillment of ancient Welsh prophecies. Some claimed he was destined to be a new King Arthur, who would lead England to unprecedented glory. Others, perhaps more prescient, warned that a prince born under such circumstances might bring great tribulation to the realm. As young Edward grew from infant to child, the contrast between these grand expectations and his gentle, withdrawn nature became increasingly apparent. While other royal children played at war games and practiced with wooden swords, Edward could often be found in the castle gardens, tending to flowers or listening to the stories told by elderly servants. His fascination with the daily routines of common folk puzzled and sometimes alarmed the nobles who observed his behaviour. The boy's unusual interests were not entirely without precedent in royal history, but they came at a time when England desperately needed strong, conventional leadership. The kingdom Edward I had built through decades of warfare and political manoeuvring required an heir who could maintain that strength through force of personality and military prowess. Yet as young Edward approached his teenage years, courtiers increasingly wondered whether this sensitive, music-loving prince possessed the iron will necessary to hold together his father's fractious empire. Even in these early years, perceptive observers might have detected the seeds of the tragedy that would eventually consume Edward's reign. His desperate need for affection and approval, his tendency to form intense emotional bonds with those who showed him kindness, his apparent indifference to the traditional pursuits of kingship, all these traits would shape the disasters to come. The castle at Caernarfon, where Edward had drawn his first breath, stood as a symbol of English conquest and Welsh submission. Yet the prince born within its walls would prove unable to maintain the dominance his father had established through blood and iron. The ancient stones that witnessed his birth would outlast his reign, his dynasty, and his reputation, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of a king whose gentle heart proved no match for the brutal realities of medieval power. As the young prince grew toward manhood, the question that haunted the court was whether this unusual heir could transform himself into the kind of ruler England needed. The answer, had they but known it, would reshape the kingdom's destiny and establish Edward II as one of history's most tragic figures, a man whose very virtues would become the instruments of his destruction. The relationship between Edward I and his son would prove to be one of the defining elements of the future king's character, a complex mixture of love, disappointment, and impossible expectations that would shape every decision Edward II would make during his troubled reign. As young Edward entered his teenage years, the weight of his father's towering reputation pressed down upon him like the stones of the very castles the great king had built to secure his conquests. Edward I had spent his entire adult life in the pursuit of military glory and territorial expansion, creating an empire that stretched from the Welsh mountains to the Scottish Highlands, with valuable holdings in France that provided both wealth and prestige to the English crown. His methods were often brutal, but none could question their effectiveness. The Welsh princes lay dead or in exile, their ancient freedoms crushed beneath English law. Scotland, though never fully conquered, had been forced to acknowledge English supremacy through a series of devastating military campaigns. For young Edward, growing up in the shadow of such accomplishments presented an almost insurmountable challenge. Every conversation at court, every lesson from his tutors, every interaction with visiting nobles served to remind him of the standard he was expected to meet. The knights and barons who served his father spoke in reverent tones of campaigns they had shared with the great king, of victories won and enemies defeated, of the glory that came from faithful service to a strong monarch. Yet even as these tales of martial prowess filled the air around him, young Edward found himself increasingly alienated from the world they described. Where his father thrived on the chaos and violence of military campaigns, the prince recoiled from unnecessary brutality. Where Edward I saw conquered peoples as subjects to be controlled through fear, his son appeared to sympathize with their suffering. This fundamental difference in temperament would create a gulf between father and son, that no amount of royal protocol could bridge. The first serious test of their relationship came when Edward I decided that his heir must learn the arts of war through direct experience. In 1300, when young Edward was 16, his father commanded him to join the royal army for a campaign against the Scots. The prince had no choice but to obey, though court observers noted his lack of enthusiasm for the enterprise. The siege of Caerlaverock Castle provided Edward with his first taste of medieval warfare, and the experience did little to inspire him with his father's love of conquest. Appointed to command the army's rear guard, the prince performed his duties adequately, but without distinction. He showed none of the fierce joy in battle that had marked his father's early military career, none of the instinctive understanding of strategy and tactics that great commanders possessed from birth. More troubling still, Edward seemed to form genuine friendships with some of the common soldiers under his command, sharing their hardships and showing concern for their welfare in ways that struck seasoned veterans as inappropriate for a royal heir. While such compassion might have been admirable in a private citizen, it raised questions about the prince's ability to make the harsh decisions that kingship would inevitably require. The political situation Edward would inherit added another layer of complexity to his training in statecraft. His father's wars had been enormously expensive, forcing the crown to borrow heavily from Italian banking houses and to impose increasingly burdensome taxes on English subjects. The very success of Edward I's military campaigns had created financial problems that would plague the kingdom for decades to come. The relationship with the English nobility presented equally challenging complications. Edward I had managed to maintain the loyalty of his great barons through a combination of personal charisma, military success, and the distribution of lands conquered from his enemies. He understood instinctively how to balance the competing interests of different factions, when to show mercy and when to demonstrate strength, how to reward faithful service while preventing any single noble from becoming too powerful. Young Edward, observing these intricate political maneuvers, seemed to lack his father's natural instincts for the delicate art of managing powerful and ambitious men. Where Edward there could inspire loyalty through the force of his personality and the promise of shared glory, his son appeared more comfortable in the company of lesser nobles and even common servants who posed no threat to royal authority. The prince's education in the broader responsibilities of kingship proceeded fitfully, hampered by his apparent lack of interest in the traditional concerns of medieval monarchy. While he learned the formal procedures of royal government and could conduct himself appropriately in ceremonial situations, Edward showed little enthusiasm for the endless details of administration that occupied so much of a king's time. His tutors reported that the prince was intelligent and capable of mastering complex subjects when they captured his interest, but that his attention often wandered during discussions of taxation, military logistics, or diplomatic negotiations. Instead, Edward seemed drawn to questions of philosophy and theology that, while intellectually stimulating, had little practical application to the business of ruling a medieval kingdom. The growing tensions between father and son came to a head in 1305, when Edward reached his 21st birthday and began to assert some independence in his choice of companions and activities. The prince had formed close friendships with several young men of the court, relationships that provided him with the emotional support and genuine affection he seemed to crave but had never received from his demanding father. Chief among these companions was a young Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston, whose father had served Edward I faithfully for many years. Gaveston possessed many of the qualities that Edward I had hoped to see in his own son. He was brave, athletically gifted, quick-witted, and utterly devoted to the prince's welfare. Yet rather than approving of this friendship, Edward began to view Gaveston with increasing suspicion and displeasure. The king's concerns stemmed not from any particular fault in Gaveston's character, but from the intensity of his son's attachment to the young knight. Edward showed a level of devotion to his friend that struck observers as excessive, even by the standards of medieval friendship. He lavished gifts upon Gaveston, sought his advice on matters both personal and political, and appeared happiest when in his companion's company. For Edward I, watching this relationship develop, the concern was not primarily moral, but practical. A king needed to maintain emotional distance from his subjects in order to make the difficult decisions that rulership required. He could not afford to show favoritism so obviously, nor could he allow personal attachments to cloud his judgment on matters of state policy. The sight of his heir forming such an intense bond with a relatively minor noble suggested that young Edward lacked the fundamental understanding of royal dignity that effective kingship demanded. The situation reached a crisis point in 1307, when the prince made the catastrophic mistake of requesting that his father grant the county of Ponthieu to Gaveston as a mark of royal favour. This territory, inherited through Edward I's marriage to Eleanor of Castile, represented both significant wealth and important strategic value. For the heir to suggest casually giving it away to his personal friend demonstrated a stunning lack of understanding of royal responsibilities. Edward I's reaction was swift and terrible. According to chroniclers, the king flew into such a rage that he physically attacked his son, tearing out handfuls of the prince's hair before banishing Gaveston from the realm entirely. The incident marked the final breakdown of any pretense of normal father-son relations, establishing a pattern of conflict that would persist until Edward I's death, as young Edward watched his closest friend sail into exile. He perhaps began to understand the lonely burden that awaited him on the throne. The lesson his father had tried to teach him was clear. A king could not afford the luxury of intimate friendships, could not allow personal feelings to influence state policy, could not show weakness by revealing his need for emotional support and companionship. Yet this was a lesson that Edward II would never truly learn, and his failure to master it would prove to be both his greatest weakness and his most human quality. In a world that demanded kings be as hard as iron, Edward remained stubbornly, tragically human. A man whose need for love and friendship would ultimately destroy him and the kingdom he was born to rule. The great Edward I had built an empire through strength and will, but he had failed to create an heir capable of maintaining what he had accomplished. As the old king's health began to decline in the early months of 1307, the question that haunted the royal court was whether his gentle, friend-loving son could somehow transform himself into the kind of ruler England needed, or whether the great edifice of Plantagenet power would crumble beneath the weight of Edward II's all-too human weaknesses. In the intricate web of medieval court politics, few relationships would prove as consequential or as destructive as the bond that formed between Prince Edward and a young Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. Their meeting, sometime around the year 1300, would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately tear apart the fabric of Edward's reign and reshape the very nature of English kingship. Piers Gaveston entered the world around 1284. The son of Arnaud de Gaveston, a Gascon nobleman who had served Edward I with distinction for over 2 decades. The Gaveston family held lands in southwestern France, in the region that formed part of the English crown's continental possessions, making them technically subjects of the English king in his capacity as Duke of Aquitaine. This connection would prove crucial in bringing young Piers into the orbit of the English royal court. Arnaud de Gaveston had fought beside Edward I in the Welsh Wars of the 2280s, bringing with him a substantial contingent of Gascon soldiers whose skill and loyalty had earned the king's respect and gratitude. His continued service through the decades that followed, including dangerous missions as a hostage to both Aragon and France, had established him as one of Edward I's most trusted retainers. It was this reputation for faithful service that led the king to bring Arnaud's younger son to England as a member of Prince Edward's household. The decision to place Piers Gaveston in the prince's circle was initially seen as a masterstroke of royal policy. The young Gascon possessed many of the qualities that Edward I hoped would inspire his son to greater martial excellence. Gaveston was athletic and graceful, excelling in the tournaments and mock combats that formed a central part of noble education. He was intelligent and quick-witted, able to hold his own in the sophisticated conversations that characterize court life. Most importantly, he displayed the kind of confident, aggressive personality that medieval society expected from its warriors and leaders. Edward I's plan was simple: surround his gentle, retiring son with companions who embodied the virtues of ideal knighthood, and perhaps their influence would transform the prince into the kind of king England needed. In Gaveston, he believed he had found the perfect model of noble behavior: brave, charming, loyal, and utterly devoted to the royal family's interests. The reality of what developed between Prince Edward and Piers Gaveston would prove far more complex and problematic than the old king had ever imagined. From their first meeting, the two young men formed a connection that transcended the normal bounds of medieval friendship. Where the prince had always seemed withdrawn and uncertain among the great nobles of the court, he blossomed in Gaveston's company, displaying a wit and confidence that few had suspected he possessed. Gaveston, for his part, seemed to understand instinctively how to reach the lonely, isolated heir to the throne. He treated Edward not as a future king to be flattered and manipulated, but as a friend to be cherished and protected. In a world where every interaction was governed by rigid protocols of rank and precedence, their relationship offered both men a refuge of genuine human connection. The nature of their bond became a subject of intense speculation among court observers. Medieval society recognized several different types of close male relationships: sworn brotherhood, adopted kinship, devoted friendship, and romantic love. And contemporaries struggled to categorize what they witnessed between the prince and his Gascon companion. Some chroniclers would later describe their connection in terms that suggested a romantic element, while others interpreted it as an unusually intense but platonic friendship. What cannot be disputed is the extraordinary devotion that Edward showed toward Gaveston from the earliest days of their relationship. The prince, who had always seemed indifferent to material possessions, began lavishing expensive gifts upon his friend: fine clothing, valuable horses, jewelry, and other tokens of royal favor that far exceeded what might normally be given to a minor noble's son. More significantly, Edward began seeking Gaveston's advice on matters both personal and political, treating the young knight almost as a brother or co-ruler. This favoritism did not go unnoticed by other members of the court, many of whom had their own reasons for seeking the prince's attention and patronage. The great earls and barons who would someday serve as Edward's chief ministers and military commanders watched with growing concern as a relatively unknown Gascon knight gained unprecedented access to the heir's ear. They began to question whether their own interests would be protected under a king who showed such obvious preference for a single individual. The situation became more complicated as Edward began to demonstrate not just affection for Gaveston, but apparent dependence upon his presence and approval. The prince, who had always struggled with the loneliness and isolation that came with his royal birth, seemed to find in his friendship with Gaveston the emotional support and unconditional acceptance he had never received from his demanding father or the calculating nobles of the court. Gaveston's own personality contributed significantly to the tensions that began to develop around their relationship. Unlike the prince, who remained gentle and somewhat diffident even in private, the Gascon knight possessed a sharp tongue and an evident pride in his newfound position. He made little effort to conceal his contempt for many of the English nobles, particularly those who had opposed his rise to prominence or questioned his influence over the future king. The young knight's arrogance was perhaps understandable given his dramatic change in circumstances. Born the younger son of a minor Gascon lord, he now found himself enjoying wealth, status, and political influence that most men could never hope to achieve. Yet his failure to show appropriate deference to the established nobility created enemies who would remember every slight and insult when the time came for reckoning. Edward I, watching these developments with growing alarm, began to realize that his plan to inspire his son through noble companionship had backfired spectacularly. Rather than making Edward more kingly, Gaveston's influence seemed to be making him more dependent, more emotional, and more willing to ignore the traditional responsibilities of his position. The sight of his heir lavishing attention on a single favourite, while neglecting the broader concerns of government, filled the old king with foreboding about the future of his dynasty. The crisis came to a head in 1306, when Prince Edward and Gaveston, along with 21 other young knights, abandoned a Scottish military campaign to attend a tournament in England. This act of desertion during active military operations represented a serious breach of duty that could not be ignored, even for the king's son. While Edward I eventually pardoned all the deserters at the intercession of Queen Margaret, the incident demonstrated how completely Gaveston's influence had undermined the prince's sense of royal responsibility. Even more troubling was the evidence that Edward was beginning to consider Gaveston not merely as a friend, but as a potential partner in government. The prince spoke openly of his intention to grant his companion significant lands and titles upon his accession to the throne, apparently without regard for the broader political implications of such favoritism. He seemed oblivious to the resentment his plans were generating among the established nobility, who began to view Gaveston as a dangerous threat to their own positions and privileges. The final confrontation between Edward I and his son over the Gaveston issue came in February 1307, when the prince made his disastrous request for the county of Ponthieu to be granted to his friend. The king's violent reaction, physically attacking his son and immediately banishing Gaveston from the realm, reflected not just personal anger, but genuine fear for the future of English royal authority. Edward I understood, as his son apparently did not, that medieval kingship depended upon maintaining a careful balance among competing noble factions. A king who showed obvious favoritism to a single individual, particularly one without significant independent power or noble connections, risked alienating the very men whose support was essential for effective government. The sight of the heir to the throne making such elementary political errors suggested that Edward II would face serious challenges to his authority from the moment of his accession. As Gaveston sailed into his first exile in the spring of 1307, both he and Prince Edward perhaps began to understand the price of their extraordinary friendship. The bond between them had brought them great joy and companionship, but it had also marked them both as political liabilities in the eyes of England's governing class. the pattern of conflict, reconciliation, and renewed confrontation that would characterize Edward II's entire reign had already been established before he even inherited the throne. The stage was now set for a tragedy that would consume not just Edward and Gaveston themselves, but the entire kingdom they would attempt to govern. In their naive belief that personal affection could overcome political reality, they had created the conditions for their own destruction and the destruction of countless others who would be drawn into the whirlwind of their doomed relationship. On the 7th day of July, 1307, as the summer sun cast long shadows across the northern English countryside near Berg by Sands, Edward I drew his final breath, his body finally succumbing to the dysentery that had plagued him during his last campaign against the Scots. With his death, the crown of England passed to his 23-year-old son, who would face the enormous challenge of governing a kingdom that his father had expanded through conquest, but left financially exhausted and politically unstable. The news of Edward I's death reached Prince Edward at Carlisle, where he had been waiting with growing anxiety for word of his father's condition. The moment that courtiers knelt before him and addressed him as Your Majesty marked the beginning of a reign that would test every aspect of his character and ultimately demonstrate the tragic consequences of placing personal desires above political wisdom. Edward II's first act as king revealed both his priorities and his fundamental misunderstanding of the delicate balance that maintained royal authority. Within days of his accession, he dispatched urgent messages to recall Piers Gaveston from exile, apparently giving no thought to the political ramifications of such an immediate and public reversal of his father's final command. The speed with which he moved to restore his favourite suggested to observers that Edward valued Gaveston's companionship more highly than the dignity of the crown itself. The reunion between king and favourite took place in early August, away from the prying eyes of the court, but not beyond the reach of gossip and speculation. Contemporary chroniclers noted that Edward displayed more joy at Gaveston's return than he had shown upon inheriting the throne of England, an observation that would be remembered by his enemies in the dark days to come. The sight of a new king showing such obvious emotion over a mere knight's presence struck many as unseemly and politically dangerous. What followed next shocked even those courtiers who had grown accustomed to Edward's favoritism toward the Gascon knight. On August 6th, less than a month after becoming king, Edward granted Piers Gaveston the earldom of Cornwall, one of the most prestigious titles in the English nobility, and one traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. The unprecedented nature of this elevation sent waves of dismay through the established aristocracy, who recognized it as a direct challenge to the existing social order. The earldom of Cornwall brought with it vast estates across southwestern England, holdings in the Midlands and the North, and an annual income of approximately £4,000, a sum that placed Gaveston among the wealthiest men in the kingdom virtually overnight. More significantly, the title carried with it a seat among the most powerful barons of the realm, granting the former minor knight a voice in all major decisions of state and a position of influence that many families had spent generations trying to achieve. Edward's justification for this extraordinary grant revealed his naive understanding of political realities. He appears to have believed that by elevating Gaveston to the highest ranks of the nobility, he could silence criticism of their friendship and create a situation where his favourite would be accepted as an equal by the great earls of England. The king failed to recognise that sudden elevation often bred resentment rather than respect, and that the established nobility would view Gaveston's rise as a threat to their own positions rather than a welcome addition to their ranks. The choice of Cornwall specifically added insult to injury in the eyes of many observers. Edward the Fern had intended this earldom for one of his younger sons from his second marriage, and its diversion to Gaveston represented not just political favoritism, but a betrayal of the late king's explicit wishes. The symbolism was clear. Edward II valued his personal attachments more highly than his family obligations or the traditional patterns of noble inheritance. As if the grant of Cornwall were not controversial enough, Edward soon arranged an even more provocative demonstration of his favour toward Gaveston. In November 1307, he orchestrated a marriage between his friend and Margaret de Clare, the daughter of the powerful Earl of Gloucester and niece of the king himself. This union connected Gaveston to one of England's most influential noble families and provided him with additional wealth and political connections that further enhanced his already dramatic rise in status. The marriage to Margaret de Clare was a masterstroke of political calculation, but not in the way Edward intended. Rather than legitimizing Gaveston's position, it served to highlight the extraordinary lengths to which the king was willing to go to advance his favourite's interests. The great earls who witnessed the ceremony understood that they were seeing the emergence of a new force in English politics, one that derived its power not from military service, administrative skill, or ancient lineage, but solely from the king's personal affection. Even as these dramatic elevations took place, Edward was simultaneously neglecting the urgent business of government that required his attention. The Scottish situation remained volatile, with Robert the Bruce using Edward I's death as an opportunity to launch new attacks against English positions north of the border. The royal treasury, depleted by decades of military campaigns, desperately needed attention from a king willing to address the complex problems of taxation and debt management. Most pressingly, the great barons of England expected their new monarch to consult with them on policy matters and to demonstrate the kind of strong leadership that had characterized his father's reign. Instead, Edward appeared more interested in planning elaborate entertainments for his newly elevated favourite than in attending to the mundane but essential work of kingship. The court buzzed with stories of private dinners where the king and Gaveston dined alone, while great nobles waited for audiences, of important documents left unsigned, while Edward listened to his friends' amusing stories of crucial military decisions postponed because the king preferred to spend his time in Gaveston's company. The situation reached a new level of public scandal during the Christmas festivities of 1307, when Edward organised a magnificent tournament at Wallingford Castle specifically to honour Gaveston and showcase his newfound status as Earl of Cornwall. What should have been a celebration of royal dignity and noble prowess instead became a humiliating demonstration of the established nobility's declining influence under the new regime. Gaveston, fighting alongside carefully chosen companions, systematically defeated the teams led by some of England's most respected earls, including the Earl of Warenne, the Earl of Hereford, and the Earl of Arundel. Whether through superior skill, better preparation, or questionable tactics, the king's favourite emerged triumphant from every encounter, leaving his noble opponents to nurse both their physical bruises and their wounded pride. The tournament at Wallingford marked a turning point in the relationship between Edward II and his nobility. What had begun as grumbling about royal favouritism now hardened into active opposition to Gaveston's influence. The earls who had suffered public humiliation at his hands began to consider more drastic measures to protect their interests and restore what they saw as the proper order of English politics. Edward, observing the growing tensions around his favourite, seemed incapable of understanding the political dynamics he had unleashed. In his mind, He had simply rewarded a faithful friend and skilled knight with the recognition he deserved. The king appeared genuinely puzzled by the hostility that Gaveston's elevation had generated, failing to recognize that his actions had fundamentally altered the balance of power at court in ways that threatened the entire structure of noble governance. As 1308 dawned, Edward prepared for two momentous events that would further define his reign: his marriage to Isabella of France and his coronation as King of England. Both ceremonies would provide Gaveston with opportunities to display his new status and would create additional sources of tension between the king and his increasingly alienated nobility. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether Edward's personal loyalties could survive the harsh realities of medieval politics. The new king's dangerous generosity had already begun to undermine the very foundations of his authority. In seeking to elevate his friend, Edward had diminished himself, creating enemies where he needed allies and demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of the principles that govern successful medieval kingship. The tragedy that would ultimately consume both king and favourite had its roots in these early months of Edward's reign, when his desperate need for companionship overwhelmed his political judgment and set him on a path toward destruction. The year 1308 marked the beginning of Edward II's formal confrontation with the harsh realities of medieval governance. As the enthusiasm that had initially greeted his accession gave way to growing alarm among England's most powerful nobles, the king's marriage to Isabella of France and his subsequent coronation should have represented moments of triumph and unity for the realm, but instead they became flashpoints for conflict over Piers Gaveston's unprecedented influence and Edward's apparent indifference to traditional royal responsibilities. The journey to France for Edward's marriage provided an early indication of how completely Gaveston had come to dominate the king's thinking. Rather than appointing one of his relatives or most senior nobles to serve as regent during his absence, Edward granted this crucial responsibility to his favourite. Despite Gaveston's limited experience in government and his controversial status among the English aristocracy, the decision shocked contemporary observers who recognized that the regency traditionally belonged to members of the royal family or figures of unquestioned authority and respect. Gaveston's brief tenure as regent passed without major incident, but his appointment sent a clear message about Edward's priorities that was not lost on the great earls of England. They began to understand that the king viewed his Gascon friend not merely as a companion, but as a potential partner in government whose influence might eclipse their own traditional roles as royal advisors and administrators. The wedding itself, celebrated at Boulogne-sur-Mer on January 25th, 1308, represented a diplomatic triumph that should have strengthened Edward's position considerably. Isabella of France was beautiful, intelligent, and politically astute, exactly the kind of queen consort who could have provided invaluable support to a struggling monarch. Yet even this momentous occasion was overshadowed by concerns about Gaveston's role and Edward's apparent priorities. Upon their return to England, the royal couple's coronation at Westminster Abbey on February 25th became another source of controversy rather than celebration. Edward had assigned Gaveston a prominent role in the ceremonies, placing him in positions of honour traditionally reserved for the most senior nobles of the realm. More troublingly, contemporary chroniclers noted that the king seemed to pay more attention to his favourite during the coronation feast than to his new bride, an observation that scandalised both the English court and the French delegation that had accompanied Isabella. The sight of their new queen being overshadowed by a relatively minor knight struck many observers as both personally insulting to Isabella and politically dangerous for the realm. Marriage alliances were the foundation of medieval diplomacy, and Edward's behaviour threatened to undermine the very relationship with France that the union was meant to strengthen. Philip IV, Isabella's powerful father, took careful note of how his daughter was being treated and began to reconsider his support for his son-in-law's regime. As the excitement of the coronation faded, the practical problems of governing England began to assert themselves with increasing urgency. The ongoing conflict in Scotland demanded immediate attention, as Robert the Bruce had used the period of transition between reigns to reconquer much of the territory that Edward I had previously secured. The royal treasury remained perilously depleted, forcing Edward to consider new taxes at precisely the moment when his political position was most vulnerable. Most pressingly, the great nobles of England were becoming increasingly organised in their opposition to Gaveston's influence. Led initially by Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, and including such powerful figures as Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, and Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, they began to coordinate their efforts to limit what they saw as the dangerous favoritism that was undermining traditional governance. The Earl's concerns were not merely personal jealousy over Gaveston's rapid rise, though that element certainly played a role. They genuinely believed that Edward's obvious dependence on a single advisor was weakening the crown's authority and creating dangerous precedents for future reigns. Medieval kingship required the careful management of competing noble interests, and a monarch who showed such obvious favoritism to one individual risked losing the broader support that effective government demanded. The first formal expression of noble opposition came in the so-called Bologna Agreement of January 1308, a document that criticised royal policies in general terms without specifically naming Gaveston. The earls complained about oppression of the people and attacks on the honour of the crown, language that clearly referred to the king's favoritism while maintaining a veneer of respectful protest. When this indirect approach failed to produce any change in Edward's behaviour, the opposition became more direct. In April 1308, Parliament presented the king with what became known as the Declaration of 1308, a formal demand for Gaveston's renewed exile. The document still avoided mentioning the favourite by name, but its meaning was unmistakable. The greatest nobles of England considered his continued presence a threat to the realm's welfare. Edward's initial response revealed both his political naivety and his emotional dependence on Gaveston's support. Rather than attempting to negotiate a compromise that might have preserved both his friend's position and noble unity, the king simply refused to consider the request. He appeared genuinely unable to understand why his subjects would object to his rewarding a faithful companion, and he seemed to believe that royal authority alone would be sufficient to overcome any opposition. The crisis deepened when Philip IV of France added his voice to the calls for Gaveston's exile. The French king had been offended by reports of how his daughter was being treated at the English court, and he saw the favourite as a symbol of Edward's unfitness for kingship. Philip's intervention transformed what had been a domestic political dispute into an international crisis, as Edward suddenly faced the prospect of losing his most important ally while simultaneously battling opposition from his own nobles. Faced with this overwhelming pressure, Edward finally capitulated in May 1308, agreeing to send Gaveston into exile once again. Yet even in accepting this defeat, the king managed to demonstrate his continued devotion to his favourite in ways that further alarmed his critics. Rather than simply banishing Gaveston, Edward appointed him Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a position that would allow him to maintain his dignity while providing opportunities for continued wealth and influence. The appointment to Ireland was actually a shrewd political move that demonstrated Edward's capacity for strategic thinking when his personal interests were at stake. The Irish lordship was notoriously difficult to govern, plagued by rebellious native chieftains and fractious Anglo-Irish nobles who resented English authority. By sending Gaveston there, Edward could argue that he was assigning his favourite to a challenging and important post, rather than simply surrendering to noble pressure. Gaveston's performance in Ireland would ultimately vindicate Edward's confidence in his abilities. The young Earl proved to be an effective military commander, defeating several Irish insurgents and restoring a measure of stability to the troubled province. His success provided Edward with ammunition for future arguments about his favourite's value to the crown, though it did little to mollify the English nobles who remained suspicious of his influence. During Gaveston's absence, Edward began the delicate work of rebuilding relationships with his alienated nobility. He distributed patronage carefully, seeking to win over potential allies while isolating his most determined opponents. The king also made a series of political concessions, agreeing to respect traditional noble privileges and to govern according to established customs rather than personal whim. These efforts met with some success, as several earls who had initially supported Gaveston's exile began to moderate their positions. Even Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, who had been among the favourite's most bitter enemies, showed signs of willingness to compromise if Edward could demonstrate greater political wisdom in the future. The key breakthrough came when Pope Clement V agreed to lift the threat of excommunication that had been imposed on Gaveston as a condition of his exile. This papal intervention provided Edward with the legal justification he needed to recall his friend, while also offering the English nobles a face-saving way to accept his return without appearing to simply surrender to royal pressure. In June 1309, Piers Gaveston returned to England after an absence of just over a year, his reputation somewhat enhanced by his Irish successes, and his position apparently secured by Edward's patient diplomatic efforts. The king immediately restored him to the earldom of Cornwall and welcomed him back to court with obvious joy, though he was careful to avoid the kind of ostentatious favoritism that had caused such problems during Gaveston's first period of prominence. For a brief moment, it seemed that Edward might have learned from his earlier mistakes and found a way to balance his personal affections with the political realities of medieval kingship. The great earls accepted Gaveston's return with resigned tolerance, while the favourite himself appeared to have gained some wisdom from his exile and showed greater deference to noble sensibilities. Yet this fragile peace would prove short-lived, as neither Edward nor Gaveston had truly absorbed the lessons of their earlier confrontation. The fundamental tensions that had driven the crisis of 1308 remained unresolved, lying dormant beneath the surface of court life like embers waiting for the right conditions to burst once again into destructive flame. The stage was set for an even more dramatic confrontation that would ultimately destroy both the king's favourite and the stability of English government itself. The pattern of conflict, exile and return that had characterised Edward's early relationship with his nobility established a template that would define his entire reign. His inability to choose definitively between personal loyalty and political necessity would create a cycle of crisis that would ultimately consume not just Gaveston, but Edward himself and countless others who were drawn into the widening spiral of medieval England's political collapse. The autumn of 1309 should have marked a new beginning for Edward II's troubled reign, as his patient diplomatic efforts appeared to have secured acceptance for Piers Gaveston's return from the great nobles, who had previously demanded his exile. The fragile peace that had been negotiated seemed to offer hope that the king might finally have learned to balance his personal affections with the harsh realities of medieval politics. Yet this optimism would prove tragically misplaced, as both Edward and his favourite demonstrated their fundamental inability to resist the temptations that had created their earlier troubles. Gaveston's return to court in the summer of 1309 was initially marked by a studiousness that suggested he had learned valuable lessons during his year of exile in Ireland. The Earl showed greater deference to his noble colleagues, avoided the ostentatious displays of royal favour that had previously caused such offence, and generally conducted himself with the dignity appropriate to his elevated station. Edward, too, seemed more conscious of the need to distribute his attention and patronage more evenly among his various advisers and supporters. Yet beneath this veneer of political wisdom, neither man had truly changed. Edward's emotional dependence on Gaveston's companionship remained as strong as ever, while the favourite's natural arrogance and sharp tongue had been only temporarily suppressed rather than fundamentally altered. The stage was set for a renewal of the conflicts that had previously brought the kingdom to the brink of civil war. The first cracks in the carefully constructed peace began to appear as Gaveston gradually resumed his previous position of influence at court. Edward found it impossible to resist seeking his friend's advice on important matters, and soon the Earl was once again enjoying the kind of exclusive access to royal decision-making that had previously caused such alarm among the established nobility. The king's attempts to disguise this favoritism through careful protocol and formal procedures fooled no one who understood the realities of medieval governance. More troublingly, Gaveston began to display the same contempt for his noble colleagues that had characterized his earlier period of prominence. His military successes in Ireland had enhanced his self-confidence, while his restoration to favour despite previous opposition had convinced him that his enemies lacked the power to threaten his position seriously. This dangerous overconfidence would soon manifest itself in ways that would prove catastrophic for both his own survival and the stability of Edward's reign. The crisis that would destroy the fragile peace began with what should have been a moment of celebration and noble fellowship. In December 1309, Edward decided to organise a grand tournament at Wallingford Castle, ostensibly to celebrate the Christmas season, but actually to provide an opportunity for Gaveston to display his martial skills and enhance his reputation among the English nobility. The king appears to have believed that a demonstration of his favourite's military prowess would finally convince the great earls to accept him as a worthy member of their ranks. The tournament format that Edward chose reflected both medieval traditions of noble competition and his own desire to showcase Gaveston's abilities. Rather than individual combats between single knights, the event would feature team competitions that pitted groups of nobles against each other in elaborate mock battles. These contests required not only individual skill, but also strategic thinking and leadership abilities, making them an excellent venue for demonstrating the qualities that medieval society valued most highly in its ruling class. Gaveston accepted the challenge with obvious relish, apparently viewing the tournament as an opportunity to settle scores with nobles who had previously opposed his rise to power. He assembled a team of carefully chosen companions, many of them fellow Gascons or English knights, who owed their advancement to royal favour rather than ancient lineage. This selection process itself represented a subtle insult to the established nobility, as it suggested that merit and royal approval mattered more than traditional noble rank. The earls who agreed to participate in the tournament did so with mixed motives. Some genuinely hoped that a fair contest might provide a way to resolve their differences with Gaveston through honourable competition, rather than political manoeuvring. Others, particularly those who had suffered previous humiliations at the favourite's hands, saw the event as an opportunity to demonstrate their own superior skills and restore their damaged reputations. Chief among Gaveston's opponents were some of England's most powerful and respected nobles: John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, and veteran of countless military campaigns; Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, whose family had served the crown with distinction for generations; and Edmund Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, whose wealth and influence made him one of the kingdom's most important political figures. These men represented the cream of English nobility, and their participation lent the tournament both prestige and an undercurrent of serious political tension. The contests themselves unfolded over several days, with various competitions designed to test different aspects of knightly skill and prowess. The culminating event was a grand melee in which teams of knights fought with blunted weapons until one side achieved clear victory through superior tactics and endurance. It was in this final contest that the underlying tensions between Gaveston and his opponents would explode into open conflict. Contemporary accounts of the tournament's climactic battle differ in their details, but all agree on its shocking outcome. Gaveston's team achieved a decisive and humiliating victory over their noble opponents, systematically defeating some of the most respected military leaders in England in full view of the assembled court. Whether this triumph resulted from superior preparation, better tactics, questionable practices that bent the rules of fair competition, or simply genuine martial superiority, remains a matter of historical debate. What cannot be disputed is the devastating impact that this public humiliation had on the great earls who suffered defeat at Gaveston's hands. These men, who had built their reputations on military prowess and viewed their martial skills as the foundation of their social status, found themselves reduced to objects of mockery by a man they considered an upstart foreigner who owed everything to royal favoritism. The psychological wound inflicted by this defeat would fester and eventually burst into violence that would tear the kingdom apart. Even more damaging than the tournament defeat itself was Gaveston's behaviour in the aftermath of his victory. Rather than showing the magnanimity that medieval chivalric tradition demanded of victorious knights, the Earl chose to compound his opponent's humiliation through a series of mocking nicknames that displayed both his wit and his fatal lack of political wisdom. The nicknames that Gaveston bestowed upon his defeated opponents became legendary in their time and have remained famous throughout history for their cleverness and their devastating accuracy. Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, an elderly nobleman whose corpulent figure reflected a lifetime of good living, became Bursbelly in Gaveston's cruel lexicon. Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, whose careful financial management and business acumen had made him wealthy, was dubbed Joseph the Jew, in reference to both his money-lending activities and biblical precedent. Perhaps most fatally, Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, received the nickname the Black Dog of Arden, a reference both to his dark complexion and his estates in the ancient forest of Arden in Warwickshire. This particular insult struck at the very heart of Warwick's identity, mocking both his physical appearance and his ancestral lands in a way that made reconciliation virtually impossible. Thomas of Lancaster, Edward's cousin, and potentially the most dangerous of his opponents due to his vast wealth and royal connections, was labelled the Fiddler, for reasons that remain unclear, but were apparently obvious enough to contemporary observers to make the nickname sting. Some historians suggest this referred to Lancaster's political manoeuvring, while others believe it mocked some personal habit or characteristic that struck Gaveston as amusing. These nicknames, while demonstrating Gaveston's considerable wit and his keen eye for human weakness, represented a catastrophic failure of political judgment that would ultimately cost him his life. In medieval society, honour and reputation were literally matters of life and death, and Gaveston's public mockery of some of England's most powerful men created enemies who would never forgive or forget the humiliation they had suffered. The Earl's fatal error lay in his apparent belief that Edward's protection was sufficient to shield him from the consequences of his actions. He seems to have thought that royal favour granted him immunity from the normal rules of noble society, allowing him to insult and humiliate his social superiors without fear of retaliation. This miscalculation would prove to be one of the most significant political mistakes in English medieval history. Edward's response to the tournament and its aftermath demonstrated his own continuing failure to understand the political dynamics he had unleashed. Rather than recognizing the danger that Gaveston's behavior had created, the king appeared to revel in his favourite's triumph over nobles who had previously opposed his policies. He made no effort to moderate Gaveston's mockery or to repair the damaged relationships that were essential for effective governance. The tournament of 1309 and the nicknames that followed marked the point of no return in the relationship between Edward II and his nobility. What had been political opposition based on policy disagreements now became personal hatred rooted in wounded pride and public humiliation. The great Earls of England began to understand that Gaveston would never be content to serve as merely one advisor among many, but instead sought to establish himself as the power behind the throne through the systematic degradation of his rivals. In the months that followed the tournament, the political atmosphere at court grew increasingly poisonous as both sides began to prepare for what now seemed like inevitable conflict. The fragile peace that had been so carefully constructed collapsed under the weight of personal animosity and wounded honour, setting the stage for the violent confrontation that would ultimately destroy both Gaveston and the stability of English government. The Earl's clever-tongued had proved sharper than any sword in inflicting wounds that would never heal. But unlike a blade, his words could not protect him from the enemies he had created. The nicknames that had seemed so amusing in the moment of victory would echo in the chambers where his death warrant was signed, proof that in the deadly game of medieval politics, wit without wisdom was often a fatal combination. The year 1311 opened with England balanced on the knife's edge of civil war, as the great nobles who had suffered humiliation at Piers Gaveston's hands moved from private resentment to organised resistance against what they saw as an intolerable threat to the traditional order of English governance. The Earl's mocking nicknames had transformed political opposition into personal vendetta, while Edward II's continued support for his favourite convinced the baronial opposition that only drastic action could restore the proper balance of power in the kingdom. The crisis reached its formal beginning in March 1311, when a group of prominent earls presented Edward with an ultimatum that would reshape the nature of English constitutional government. Led by Thomas of Lancaster, the king's own cousin and the wealthiest nobleman in England, they demanded the appointment of a committee of Lords Ordainers who would reform both the royal household and the broader administration of the kingdom. This body would consist of 21 carefully chosen nobles and prelates who would have sweeping powers to investigate royal policies, dismiss unpopular officials, and impose binding restrictions on the Crown's activities. Edward's acceptance of this demand represented a devastating blow to royal authority that his father would never have contemplated. Yet the king found himself with little choice, as the earls commanded sufficient military force to plunge the kingdom into civil war if their demands were rejected. The appointment of the Ordainers marked the first time since the reign of Henry III that English nobles had successfully imposed external control over royal government, establishing a precedent that would haunt the monarchy for generations to come. While the Ordainers began their work of investigating royal administration and drafting their comprehensive reform program, Edward made a desperate attempt to restore his political fortunes through military success in Scotland. The situation north of the border had deteriorated dramatically since his accession, as Robert the Bruce had used the period of English political instability to reconquer much of the territory that Edward I had previously secured through decades of brutal warfare. The Scottish campaign of 1311 proved to be another humiliating failure that further undermined Edward's already damaged reputation. Rather than engaging the English army in open battle where his numerical disadvantage would be telling, Bruce employed the guerrilla tactics that had served him so well in previous years. The Scottish king avoided direct confrontation while launching devastating raids against English positions, gradually wearing down his opponents through a war of attrition that Edward was psychologically and financially unprepared to sustain. The futile campaign drained the royal treasury of resources that were desperately needed for domestic politics, while providing Bruce with opportunities to demonstrate his superior strategic thinking and political acumen. More damaging still, the obvious failure of English arms under Edward's personal command provided his critics with additional ammunition for their arguments that the kingdom required fundamental changes in its leadership and governance. When the Ordainers finally presented their completed program in September 1311, the document represented the most comprehensive restriction of royal power in English history since Magna Carta. The ordinances of 1311 imposed sweeping limitations on the Crown's freedom of action, requiring parliamentary approval for declarations of war, major appointments, and grants of land or treasure. They established new procedures for controlling royal finances and created mechanisms for ensuring that future kings would govern according to law rather than personal whim. Most significantly for the immediate crisis, the ordinances explicitly demanded Piers Gaveston's permanent exile from all territories under English control, including Ireland and Gascony, where he had previously found refuge. The document branded him as an enemy of the realm, whose very presence corrupted royal government and threatened the stability of the kingdom. The Ordainers made clear that they would accept no compromise on this point. Gaveston must go, and he must never be allowed to return. Edward's response to the ordinances revealed the depths of his political desperation and emotional dependence on his favourite's support. Rather than accepting what was essentially a negotiated surrender, the king chose to engage in a dangerous game of deception that would ultimately precipitate the very violence he was trying to avoid. He publicly accepted the Ordainers' demands and promised to implement their reforms, while secretly planning to restore Gaveston to power at the first opportunity. The pretense was maintained just long enough for Gaveston to make his formal departure from England in November 1311, sailing ostensibly for permanent exile, but actually heading for temporary refuge in Flanders. Edward's plan was to wait until political attention had moved to other matters, then quietly recall his favourite and present his opponents with a fait accompli that they would be forced to accept or challenge through open rebellion. This strategy might have succeeded if Edward had possessed the patience and political skill to implement it gradually and carefully. Instead, driven by his emotional need for Gaveston's companionship and his anger at the humiliations he had suffered, the king moved far too quickly and openly to restore his favourite to power. By Christmas 1311, Gaveston was already back in England, reunited with Edward at York, and immediately restored to all his former titles and privileges. The speed of Gaveston's return and the publicity surrounding his restoration convinced the ordainers that Edward had never intended to honour his commitments to reform. They began to understand that the king viewed the ordinances not as a binding constitutional settlement, but as a temporary inconvenience to be circumvented as soon as circumstances permitted. This realization transformed what had been a political dispute into a fundamental conflict over the nature of royal authority and the rule of law. The great earls, who had previously sought to resolve their differences with Gaveston through legal and constitutional means, now began to consider more drastic measures. Led by Thomas of Lancaster, whose vast estates provided him with the military resources necessary for sustained resistance, they started mobilizing their private armies and forging alliances with other disaffected nobles who shared their determination to end Gaveston's influence once and for all. The prospect of civil war loomed increasingly large as both sides prepared for what now seemed like inevitable conflict. Edward began fortifying strategic positions and calling in military obligations from nobles who remained loyal to the crown, while the ordainers coordinated their efforts to isolate the king and his favourite from potential sources of support. The kingdom that Edward I had united through conquest and political skill was fracturing along lines of personal loyalty and factional interest. The final phase of the crisis began in the spring of 1312, when the baronial opposition launched coordinated military operations designed to capture both Edward and Gaveston and force a final resolution of the constitutional crisis. The king and his favourite, recognizing that their position had become untenable, abandoned London and fled northward, hoping to reach Scotland where they might find temporary refuge or at least gather loyal forces for a counterattack. The pursuit that followed took on the character of a deadly game of chess played across the English countryside as the royal fugitives tried desperately to stay ahead of their enemies while seeking some secure position from which they might negotiate or resist. Edward's lack of military experience and Gaveston's overconfidence in his own abilities proved fatal disadvantages in this contest of strategic thinking and political manoeuvring. The decisive moment came when the royal party reached Newcastle, where they barely escaped capture by a force led by Thomas of Lancaster and other prominent ordainers. The near miss convinced Edward that their situation was hopeless unless they could reach the presumed safety of Scotland, but it also demonstrated to Gaveston that his enemies were better organised and more determined than he had previously realised. Faced with the reality that they could not outrun their pursuers indefinitely, Edward and Gaveston made the fatal decision to split their forces. The king would continue northward with the hope of raising additional troops, while Gaveston would take refuge in the supposedly impregnable fortress of Scarborough Castle on the Yorkshire coast. This strategic blunder separated the two men at precisely the moment when their enemies were closing in for the kill. Scarborough Castle had seemed like the perfect refuge for a fugitive earl. Its position on a rocky promontory overlooking the North Sea made it virtually impossible to storm, while its well-stocked storerooms could sustain a lengthy siege. Gaveston apparently believed that he could hold out indefinitely, while Edward gathered loyal forces for a relief expedition, or at least until political circumstances changed in ways that might permit a negotiated settlement. The Earl's confidence proved tragically misplaced. The baronial forces that surrounded Scarborough were led by some of England's most experienced military commanders, including Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, and Henry Percy, both veterans of countless sieges who understood perfectly how to reduce even the strongest fortifications. More importantly, they possessed the patience and resources necessary for a prolonged campaign. While Gaveston's isolation meant that no relief was likely to arrive in time to save him, the siege of Scarborough lasted for several weeks, during which Gaveston's position gradually became hopeless as his supplies dwindled and his small garrison grew increasingly demoralized. The Earl's attempts to break out of the castle failed disastrously, while his messages to Edward requesting immediate assistance went unanswered as the king struggled with his own military problems in the north. Finally, on May 19, 1312, Gaveston was forced to accept the inevitable and surrender to his besiegers. The terms of his capitulation appeared favourable on the surface. He would be taken to York for negotiations with the king, and if no agreement could be reached by August 1st, he would be allowed to return to Scarborough and resume the siege. 3 prominent earls, Pembroke, Surrey, and Percy, swore formal oaths to guarantee his personal safety during this process. Yet, even as Gaveston emerged from Scarborough Castle, to begin what he hoped would be a journey toward political rehabilitation, his enemies were preparing the trap that would finally destroy him. The favourable surrender terms were merely a ruse designed to lure him into vulnerability, while the oaths of protection would prove worthless when tested against the demands of political necessity and personal vengeance. The hunt that had begun with the ordinances of 1311 was now approaching its climax, as Piers Gaveston travelled toward what he believed would be salvation, but was actually his doom. The Earl's long run of political luck was finally about to end in the most dramatic and violent way possible, setting the stage for the brutal execution that would forever change the nature of English politics and royal authority. The journey from Scarborough Castle that began on May 19, 1312, should have been the start of Piers Gaveston's return to political relevance, a carefully negotiated passage under noble protection that would lead to discussions with King Edward and perhaps some face-saving compromise that might allow the controversial Earl to retain at least a portion of his former influence. Instead, it became the final chapter in a story of ambition, friendship, and fatal miscalculation that would end in violence and forever alter the balance of power in medieval England. Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, had emerged as the primary guarantor of Gaveston's safety during the journey to York, a responsibility that the experienced nobleman took seriously, both as a matter of personal honour and political necessity. Pembroke understood that any violation of the terms under which Gaveston had surrendered would reflect poorly on his own reputation and might complicate future negotiations with other political opponents. His oath of protection was meant to ensure safe passage, nothing more, but it placed him in an impossible position between his personal commitments and the broader political pressures that were building around the captive Earl. The initial stages of the journey proceeded according to plan, with Gaveston's small escort making steady progress southward through Yorkshire, while maintaining the pretense that they were heading toward productive negotiations in York. The captive Earl appeared optimistic about his prospects, perhaps believing that his previous ability to survive political crises would serve him well once again. He had weathered exile twice before and returned to even greater prominence, and there was no obvious reason why this latest setback could not be overcome through the same combination of royal favour and political manoeuvring that had characterised his entire career. Yet beneath the surface of this orderly progression, darker forces were already at work. Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, whose bitter enmity toward Gaveston had been intensified by the insulting nickname the Black Dog of Arden, had been monitoring the escort's movements with predatory patience. Warwick understood that this might be his only opportunity to settle accounts with the man who had humiliated him so publicly, and he was prepared to take extraordinary risks to ensure that Gaveston would never again have the chance to mock the English nobility. The crisis came on June 9th, when Pembroke made the fateful decision to leave Gaveston temporarily in the custody of others while he visited his wife at nearby Bampton. This brief separation, which should have been a minor logistical detail, created the opening that Warwick had been waiting for. The Earl had positioned his men strategically throughout the region, and news of Gaveston's vulnerable position reached him quickly through the network of informants and sympathizers he had cultivated among the local gentry. The rectory at Deddington, where Gaveston spent what would prove to be his final night of freedom, was a comfortable but defensible position that had seemed adequate for the temporary accommodation of a high-ranking prisoner. The building's stone walls and strategic location provided reasonable security against casual threats, while its proximity to major roads made it a convenient stopping point for the journey to York. Yet these same advantages that made Deddington attractive as a way station also made it vulnerable to attack by a well-organized force with local knowledge and superior numbers. Warwick's assault on the rectory came at dawn on June 10th, catching Gaveston's guards completely unprepared for the sudden appearance of a substantial military force. The Earl had planned his operation carefully, surrounding the building with enough armed men to prevent any possibility of escape, while avoiding the kind of prolonged siege that might allow time for rescue attempts or political intervention. His goal was swift capture rather than destruction, though he was clearly prepared to use whatever violence might prove necessary to achieve his objectives. The confrontation itself was brief and decisive, as Gaveston's small escort was overwhelmed by Warwick's superior numbers before they could mount any effective resistance. The captive Earl, awakened from sleep to find enemy soldiers breaking down his door, had no opportunity to organize a defense or attempt an escape. Within minutes, he found himself a prisoner once again, but this time in the hands of men who had no intention of honoring the legal niceties that had governed his previous treatment. Warwick's seizure of Gaveston represented a fundamental breach of medieval law and custom that shocked even those who supported the Earl's ultimate destruction. The violation of Pembroke's oath of safe conduct was particularly scandalous, as it undermined one of the basic principles that made political negotiations possible in a society where personal honor and feudal obligations provided the foundation for all governmental authority. Yet Warwick appeared to consider the political benefits of eliminating Gaveston worth the damage to his own reputation and the broader implications for English constitutional order. The journey from Deddington to Warwick Castle became a public spectacle that demonstrated both the depth of popular resentment against Gaveston and the dangerous precedent that was being established for future political conflicts. Common people lined the roads to witness the passage of the man who had symbolized royal favoritism and political corruption, many of them calling out insults and curses that reflected years of accumulated grievances against the regime he had come to represent. Gaveston's arrival at Warwick Castle marked the beginning of the final phase of his political and personal destruction. The fortress that had given Guy de Beauchamp his title now became the setting for a judicial proceeding that would combine elements of formal legal process with summary execution, creating a precedent for the violent resolution of political disputes that would haunt English politics for generations to come. The trial that convened at Warwick on June 18th brought together some of the most powerful nobles in England, including Thomas of Lancaster, Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, and Edmund Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, alongside their host, Guy de Beauchamp. These men represented the cream of the English aristocracy, veterans of countless political and military campaigns, who understood both the law and the practical requirements of governance. Yet their assembly at Warwick was motivated less by legal principles than by personal animosity and political calculation. The charges against Gaveston were comprehensive and damning, encompassing both specific violations of the ordinances of 1311 and broader accusations of corruption and misgovernment that reflected the accumulated resentments of his entire career. The earls accused him of returning from exile in violation of explicit prohibitions, of corrupting royal government through his excessive influence over the king, of enriching himself at the expense of the realm's welfare, and of showing contempt for the established nobility whose counsel should have guided royal policy. More fundamentally, the proceedings at Warwick represented an attempt to establish the principle that certain more fundamentally, the proceedings at Warwick represented an attempt to establish the principle that certain political crimes were so serious that they justified extreme measures, even when those measures violated established legal procedures. The earls argued that Gaveston's corruption of royal government posed such a threat to the realm's welfare that normal protections for noble prisoners could be set aside in favour of immediate and decisive action. Yet the legal basis for these proceedings remained questionable at best. Gaveston had committed no crime under traditional English law, and his violation of the ordinances could be seen as a dispute between the Crown and its subjects, rather than a matter for summary judgment by his political enemies. The Earl's decision to proceed with a capital trial, despite these legal difficulties, demonstrated their determination to eliminate their opponent regardless of constitutional niceties. The condemned man's behaviour during his final hours revealed both courage and a belated understanding of the political forces that had brought him to this desperate situation. Contemporary accounts suggest that Gaveston maintained his dignity throughout the proceedings, neither pleading for mercy nor attempting to shift blame to others for the choices that had led to his downfall. He appears to have accepted responsibility for his own fate, while expressing regret for the harm his actions had caused to the kingdom he had served. The sentence of death was pronounced with grim formality, though its implementation would prove more brutal than the judicial language suggested. The earls had agreed that Gaveston should die, but they remained divided over the specific method of execution and the symbolic messages they wished to convey through their choice of venue and procedure. These disagreements would ultimately lead to a particularly gruesome conclusion that would shock even the hardened political observers of medieval England. The final journey began at dawn on June 19th, 1312, as Gaveston was taken under heavy guard from Warwick Castle toward the nearby hill that would become the site of his execution. The location chosen for this grim ceremony was Blacklow Hill, a prominence that lay within the lands of Thomas of Lancaster, and thus provided both practical security and symbolic significance for the Earl's destruction. The selection of Blacklow Hill was no accident, as Lancaster's involvement in the proceedings needed to be emphasized for both legal and political reasons. As the king's cousin and the most powerful nobleman in England, Lancaster's participation legitimized what might otherwise have been seen as mere murder by his fellow conspirators. His lands provided the venue, his authority sanctioned the proceedings, and his presence ensured that the execution would be seen as an act of state justice rather than private vengeance. The small procession that wound its way through the Warwickshire countryside on that June morning carried with it the accumulated tensions and resentments that had been building in English politics for over 5 years. Gaveston, bound and under close guard, represented not just a single man facing death, but the embodiment of all the conflicts between royal prerogative and noble privilege that had torn the kingdom apart since Edward II's accession. The execution itself was carried out by 2 Welsh soldiers whose names have been lost to history, but whose actions would resonate through the centuries that followed. The choice of Welsh executioners may have been practical. Professional soldiers who could be relied upon to follow orders without question. or it may have carried symbolic weight. Given Edward's birth in Wales and the complex relationships between English royalty and Celtic peoples, the method of execution was both swift and brutal, as befitted a political killing designed to send a clear message to other potential opponents of noble authority. Gaveston was run through with swords and then beheaded, his body left lying on the hill, while his head was displayed as proof of the Earl's successful resolution of the crisis that had paralysed English government for so long. The immediate aftermath of the execution revealed the complex emotions that the deed had generated among those responsible for its planning and implementation. While the Earls had achieved their primary objective of eliminating Gaveston permanently, they also understood that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, committing an act of violence that fundamentally altered the nature of English political discourse. Guy de Beauchamp, whose personal enmity had driven much of the opposition to Gaveston, reportedly showed little remorse for the killing, viewing it as a necessary act of state that had removed a dangerous threat to the kingdom's welfare. His satisfaction was perhaps understandable given the years of humiliation he had endured at Gaveston's hands, but it also demonstrated the dangerous precedent that had been established for the violent resolution of political disputes. Thomas of Lancaster, whose lands had provided the venue for the execution, took a more complex view of the proceedings. While he had supported Gaveston's destruction as a political necessity, he also understood the broader implications of what had been done and the likelihood that Edward II would seek revenge for his favourite's death. Lancaster began almost immediately to prepare for the royal retaliation that he knew would eventually come. The body of Piers Gaveston was left unburied on Blacklow Hill for several days, a deliberate insult that emphasised the Earl's contempt for their defeated enemy and their determination to prevent any attempt to transform him into a martyr. This treatment of the corpse violated basic Christian principles and medieval customs regarding the proper handling of the dead, adding another layer of scandal to proceedings that had already shocked contemporary observers. Eventually, Dominican friars from nearby Oxford took responsibility for recovering Gaveston's remains and providing them with temporary burial, though the Earl's excommunication meant that full Christian rites could not be performed immediately. The king would later arrange for proper interment at King's Langley Priory, but only after securing papal absolution for his friend's spiritual welfare. The news of Gaveston's execution reached Edward II while he was still in the north, desperately trying to gather forces for what he had hoped would be a rescue expedition. The king's reaction combined grief, rage, and a determination for revenge that would drive his political calculations for the remainder of his reign. The loss of his closest friend and advisor left Edward emotionally devastated and politically isolated, but it also freed him from the burden of trying to protect someone whose very existence had made effective government impossible. The death on Blacklow Hill marked the end of the first phase of Edward II's troubled reign and the beginning of an even more destructive period that would ultimately lead to his own downfall. The precedent established by the Earl's violent solution to their political problems would inspire future opponents of royal authority, while Edward's thirst for revenge would drive him toward increasingly desperate and destructive policies that would alienate even his natural supporters. In the gentle rolling countryside of Warwickshire, on a hill that few had noticed before that June morning, a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. The brutal efficiency of Gaveston's execution had solved one political crisis, but it had also created conditions for even greater disasters that would ultimately consume not just the king and his enemies, but the entire fabric of English medieval society. The blood that soaked into the earth of Blacklow Hill carried with it the hopes and fears of a generation, marking the spot where medieval England began its long descent into the chaos and violence that would define the later Middle Ages. Piers Gaveston was dead, but the forces that his life and death had unleashed would continue to shape English history for decades to come. The death of Piers Gaveston on Blacklow Hill should have provided Edward II with an opportunity to rebuild his relationship with the English nobility and focus his attention on the pressing military and political challenges that faced his kingdom. Yet the king's response to his favourite's execution demonstrated the fundamental character flaws that would ultimately destroy his reign, as personal grief and a thirst for revenge overwhelmed any consideration of the practical requirements of medieval statecraft. Edward's immediate reaction to news of Gaveston's death was a vow of vengeance against those responsible that consumed his thoughts and shaped his policies for years to come, rather than recognizing the execution as the inevitable consequence of his own political mistakes. The king chose to view it as a personal betrayal that demanded retribution, regardless of the cost to his broader royal responsibilities. This emotional response would prove catastrophic for English interests in Scotland, where the military situation required immediate attention from a focused and strategically minded monarch. The Scottish situation that Edward inherited from his father had deteriorated dramatically during the years of political crisis that had paralysed English government. Robert the Bruce, crowned as King of Scots in 1306, had used the period of English internal conflict to systematically reconquer territories that Edward I had secured through decades of brutal military campaigns. By 1312, Bruce controlled most of Scotland north of the River Forth and was launching increasingly bold raids into northern England that demonstrated both his growing strength and Edward's weakness. The contrast between father and son's approaches to Scottish policy revealed the fundamental differences in their characters and capabilities. Edward I had understood that maintaining English control over Scotland required constant military pressure, sophisticated political manipulation of competing Scottish factions, and the careful management of resources to sustain long-term strategic objectives. His campaigns had been marked by meticulous planning, ruthless execution, and a clear understanding of the relationship between military success and political authority. Edward II, distracted by his conflicts with the English nobility and emotionally devastated by Gaveston's death, proved incapable of the sustained attention and strategic thinking that Scottish policy required. His sporadic attempts at military intervention lacked both the resources and the coherent planning necessary for success, while his obvious preoccupation with domestic political revenge undermined any possibility of building the broad coalition of support that effective governance demanded. The specific crisis that would lead to the disaster at Bannockburn began with the English garrison's precarious position at Stirling Castle, one of the most strategically important fortifications in Scotland. The castle commanded the main route between the Scottish Highlands and the more populated regions of the south, making it a crucial stronghold for any power seeking to control the entire kingdom. Yet, by 1313, the English garrison found itself completely isolated, surrounded by hostile territory and dependent on increasingly uncertain supply lines for survival. The castle's commander, Sir Philip Mowbray, understood that his position was becoming untenable as Bruce's forces tightened their control over the surrounding region. In a desperate attempt to resolve his impossible situation, Mowbray negotiated an agreement with Bruce's brother Edward that would surrender the castle if no relief force arrived by midsummer 1314. This arrangement followed medieval military conventions regarding siege warfare. but it also created a deadline that would force Edward II to choose between abandoning one of his most important Scottish strongholds or mounting a major military expedition at a time when he was least prepared for such an undertaking. The king's decision to attempt the relief of Stirling Castle represented both a necessary assertion of royal authority and a catastrophic miscalculation of his own capabilities and resources. Edward appears to have believed that a massive show of military force would not only save Stirling, but also restore his damaged reputation among the English nobility and demonstrate his fitness for kingship after years of political humiliation. The campaign he envisioned would be the largest English army ever assembled for operations in Scotland, a force so overwhelming that Bruce would be compelled to either flee or face certain destruction. The practical challenges of organizing such an expedition were enormous, requiring unprecedented coordination of resources from across the English realm and its continental possessions. Edward summoned approximately 2,000 heavy cavalry and 15,000 infantry, drawing on military obligations from England, Wales, and Ireland to create a polyglot army that represented the full extent of Plantagenet military power. The logistics of moving, feeding, and coordinating such a force across hostile territory would have challenged even the most experienced medieval commanders. Yet even as this massive army began to assemble, fundamental problems in planning and preparation were already undermining its chances of success. Edward's preoccupation with domestic political revenge had prevented him from developing the kind of detailed intelligence about Scottish positions and intentions that successful military operations required. The king appears to have assumed that sheer numerical superiority would be sufficient to overcome any resistance, a dangerous misconception that ignored both Bruce's tactical abilities and the advantages that defensive warfare provided to the Scottish forces. The English army that began its march north in June 1314 was impressive in size, but problematic in composition and leadership. The force included veterans of Edward I's Scottish campaigns alongside inexperienced troops who had never faced the unique challenges of warfare in the Scottish borderlands. More critically, the army's command structure reflected the political divisions that had paralysed English government, with some nobles still harbouring resentments over Gaveston's death, while others questioned Edward's competence as a military leader. Robert the Bruce, observing the English preparations with the keen eye of an experienced guerrilla fighter, understood immediately that this massive expedition represented both a grave threat and an unprecedented opportunity. If he could somehow defeat such an enormous English army, the psychological and political impact would be devastating for Edward's authority and might permanently secure Scottish independence. Yet attempting to face such overwhelming numbers in open battle would normally have been suicidal for a smaller Scottish force. Bruce's strategic genius lay in his recognition that the English army's very size created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a commander willing to abandon conventional tactical approaches. The massive English force would be difficult to maneuver in the restricted terrain around Stirling, while its dependence on elaborate supply lines would make it vulnerable to harassment and disruption. Most importantly, Edward's deadline for relieving the castle would force the English to fight at a time and place of Bruce's choosing, rather than allowing them to use their superior numbers to maximum advantage. The Scottish preparations for what would become the Battle of Bannockburn reflected both Bruce's military skills and his deep understanding of the political dynamics that would determine the conflict's ultimate significance. Rather than simply trying to avoid battle or conduct a fighting withdrawal, Bruce positioned his forces to force a decisive engagement that would either secure Scottish independence or destroy his cause entirely. This bold strategic gamble demonstrated the kind of inspired leadership that Edward II had consistently failed to provide. The English army's approach to Stirling in late June 1314 marked the culmination of years of political and military failures that had brought the kingdom to this moment of crisis. Edward's personal need to vindicate his authority and avenge his favourite's death had driven him to stake everything on a single massive military expedition that would either restore his reputation or destroy it entirely. The stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in medieval European history, a confrontation that would reshape the political landscape of the British Isles and establish principles of national independence that would resonate for centuries to come. As the two armies prepared for battle in the shadow of Stirling Castle, the contrast between their leaders could not have been more stark. Bruce, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare and driven by a clear vision of Scottish independence, faced Edward, a king whose emotional instability and political failures had brought him to this desperate gamble for redemption. The outcome of their confrontation would determine not just the fate of Scotland, but the future of Edward's troubled reign and the survival of English royal authority itself. The gentle summer landscape around Bannockburn would soon witness one of the most shocking military disasters in English history, a defeat so complete and humiliating that it would forever alter the balance of power between England and Scotland, while providing Edward's domestic enemies with additional ammunition for their arguments that the kingdom required fundamental changes in its leadership and governance. In the years that followed the devastating defeat at Bannockburn and the political chaos that marked the middle period of Edward II's reign, the king's desperate need for loyal advisors and emotional support created opportunities for a new generation of royal favourites to emerge. Chief among these was Hugh Despenser the Younger, an ambitious nobleman whose rise to power would ultimately prove even more destructive than Piers Gaveston's influence had been, though initially his emergence seemed to offer hope for political stability and more effective governance. Hugh Despenser the Younger entered Edward's circle through a combination of family connections, personal ability, and shrewd political calculation that distinguished him from the Gascon knight, whose death had left such a void in the king's inner circle. Unlike Gaveston, who had been essentially a foreign adventurer dependent entirely on royal favour, Despenser possessed independent wealth, established noble lineage, and extensive family connections that provided him with a substantial power base even before he gained the king's attention. The Despenser family had served the English crown with distinction for generations, building their reputation through loyal military service and careful political manoeuvring that had secured them substantial estates and important government positions. Hugh's father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had been a trusted advisor to Edward I and continued to play an important role in government during the early years of Edward II's reign. This family tradition of royal service provided the younger Despenser with both political legitimacy and valuable experience in the complex world of medieval court politics. The transformation of Hugh Despenser from minor courtier to royal favourite began gradually, without the dramatic suddenness that had characterised Gaveston's rise to prominence. Initially, Despenser appeared to be simply one of several ambitious young nobles seeking advancement through royal service, distinguishing himself through competent performance of routine administrative duties, rather than through any particular personal charm or exceptional abilities that might have marked him as a future favourite. The key to Despenser's eventual dominance lay in his marriage to Eleanor de Clare, daughter of Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, one of England's most powerful noble families. This union, contracted in 1306, had initially seemed like a typical aristocratic marriage designed to strengthen family alliances and consolidate landed wealth. Yet, when Eleanor's brother Gilbert was killed at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, she unexpectedly became one of the co-heiresses to the vast Gloucester inheritance, transforming her husband from a relatively minor nobleman into one of the wealthiest landowners in England. The Gloucester inheritance brought Despenser control over extensive territories in Wales and the Welsh Marches, regions that had traditionally been dominated by semi-independent lords, who owed only nominal allegiance to the English crown. These lands provided not only enormous wealth, but also military resources and strategic positions that made their holder a major factor in English politics, regardless of royal favour. Unlike Gaveston, whose power had depended entirely on Edward's continued support, Despenser possessed independent sources of strength that would make him a formidable political force even if royal favour should be withdrawn. Edward's growing reliance on Despenser's advice and companionship developed gradually during the troubled years following Bannockburn, as the king struggled to rebuild his authority in the face of continuing noble opposition and Scottish military successes. The younger Despenser possessed qualities that the emotionally damaged king found increasingly attractive. He was intelligent and well-educated, capable of providing practical advice on complex political and administrative matters. He was ambitious and ruthless, willing to pursue royal interests without the scruples that might have restrained more traditional nobles. And perhaps most importantly, he showed unwavering personal loyalty to Edward at a time when the king had few reliable allies. The political landscape that allowed Despenser to emerge as Edward's new favourite had been fundamentally altered by the events of the previous decade. The execution of Piers Gaveston had demonstrated the dangers of excessive royal favouritism, while the disaster at Bannockburn had weakened Edward's authority to the point where he could no longer simply impose his will on reluctant nobles. Any new favourite would need to be more politically sophisticated than Gaveston had been, capable of building broader coalitions of support while avoiding the kind of ostentatious behaviour that had made the Gascon knight so many enemies. Despenser understood these political realities better than his predecessor had, initially conducting himself with the dignity and restraint that had been so notably absent from Gaveston's approach to court politics. Rather than flaunting his growing influence or insulting his potential rivals, the younger Despenser worked systematically to build alliances with other nobles, while demonstrating his value to the crown through competent service in important government positions. The appointment of Despenser as Royal Chamberlain in 1318 marked his formal emergence as Edward's principal advisor. Though he had been exercising significant influence over royal policy for several years before receiving this official recognition. The Chamberlain's position provided control over access to the king and substantial influence over the distribution of royal patronage, making it one of the most powerful offices in medieval government. Despenser's appointment to this crucial post signalled Edward's complete confidence in his favourite, while also providing him with the institutional authority to implement his increasingly ambitious political agenda. Yet even as Despenser consolidated his position within Edward's government, his behaviour began to reveal the same character flaws that had ultimately destroyed Gaveston. The enormous wealth he had acquired through marriage and royal favour seemed to fuel an insatiable appetite for additional power and possessions that would eventually alienate potential allies and create new sources of political opposition. His methods of acquiring land and influence became increasingly ruthless, involving legal manipulation, economic coercion, and occasionally outright violence that shocked even the hardened political observers of medieval England. The younger Despenser's expansion of his holdings in Wales and the Welsh Marches brought him into conflict with other powerful noble families, who had their own claims and interests in these strategically important regions. His systematic campaign to acquire additional territories often involved the dispossession of established landowners through questionable legal proceedings or economic pressure that forced them to sell their inheritance at prices far below their actual value. These aggressive tactics created a growing circle of enemies who resented both his methods and his apparent immunity from the consequences of his actions. More troubling still was the evidence that Despenser was beginning to exercise the same kind of exclusive influence over Edward that had characterized Gaveston's relationship with the king. Contemporary observers noted that important policy decisions were increasingly made in private consultations between Edward and his favourite, with other advisers and traditional noble councillors finding their access to the king progressively restricted. The careful political balance that effective medieval government required was once again being undermined by royal favoritism and the concentration of power in the hands of a single individual. The transformation of Hugh Despenser from competent royal servant to dominant favourite represented a tragic repetition of the patterns that had led to Gaveston's destruction. Though the younger Despenser's superior political skills and independent power base initially made him seem like a more sustainable choice for royal favour, his rise demonstrated Edward's continued inability to learn from his previous mistakes and his persistent need for emotional support and personal loyalty that overrode his judgment about the practical requirements of effective kingship. As Despenser's influence grew and his methods became more controversial, the political tensions that had previously centred on Gaveston began to reassemble around this new focal point of royal favouritism. The great nobles who had hoped that Gaveston's death would restore traditional patterns of governance found themselves facing an even more formidable opponent, one whose wealth, connections and ruthless ambition made him potentially more dangerous than his predecessor had ever been. The stage was being set for another confrontation between royal prerogative and noble privilege, though this time the favourite's superior resources and political skills would make the conflict more complex and ultimately more destructive than the crisis that had culminated on Blacklow Hill. Edward II's inability to govern effectively, without exclusive dependence on personal favourites, was about to plunge England into an even deeper political crisis that would ultimately threaten not just his own authority, but the survival of his dynasty and the stability of English government itself. In the early years of Edward II's reign, Queen Isabella of France had represented hope for political stability and effective governance. An intelligent and capable woman, whose marriage to the English king promised to strengthen the crucial alliance between England and France, while providing Edward with the kind of sophisticated political advisor that his character so desperately needed. Yet, as the decade of the 1310s progressed, and Hugh Despenser the younger's influence over her husband grew increasingly dominant, Isabella's initial loyalty and support would gradually transform into a burning hatred that would ultimately prove more dangerous to Edward's survival than all the noble opposition he had previously faced. Isabella's transformation from devoted wife to implacable enemy was not a sudden conversion, but rather a gradual process of disillusionment and alienation that reflected both her growing understanding of Edward's character flaws and her personal experience of the humiliations that his favoritism toward male companions inflicted upon her dignity and political position. The young French princess who had arrived in England full of optimism about her role as queen consort would slowly evolve into the formidable political operator who would orchestrate her husband's destruction with ruthless efficiency. The early signs of trouble in the royal marriage had been evident from the beginning. though they were initially overshadowed by the more dramatic conflicts surrounding Piers Gaveston's influence and eventual execution. Even during their coronation ceremony, careful observers had noted Edward's apparent indifference to his new bride and his obvious preference for Gaveston's company over hers. These early slights might have been forgiven as the products of political necessity or personal shyness, but they established a pattern of behaviour that would persist throughout their relationship. Isabella's initial response to her husband's favoritism had been remarkably tolerant, perhaps reflecting both her youth and her understanding of the political realities that governed royal marriages in medieval Europe. She had even managed to establish a working relationship with Gaveston himself, recognizing that open conflict with her husband's favourite would only worsen her own position, while providing additional ammunition for those who sought to undermine royal authority. This pragmatic approach had served her well during the crisis years of Edward's early reign. The death of Gaveston in 1312 had briefly raised Isabella's hopes that her marriage might develop into something more resembling a normal royal partnership, with Edward finally freed from the emotional dependence that had so dominated his thinking and political calculations. For a few years the king had indeed seemed attentive to his wife's counsel and more willing to include her in important policy discussions, suggesting that maturity and the harsh lessons of political failure might have taught him the value of building broader coalitions of support. Yet the emergence of Hugh Despenser the Younger as Edward's new favourite would prove far more threatening to Isabella's position than Gaveston's influence had ever been. Where the Gascon knight had been essentially a companion and military advisor, Despenser possessed both the ambition and the political skills to construct a comprehensive system of power that would marginalize not just the traditional nobility, but the Queen herself. His rise represented a fundamental challenge to Isabella's role as Queen Consort and her expectations about her place in English government. The conflict between Isabella and Despenser began gradually, masked by the formal courtesies that governed court life and the political necessities that required both to maintain at least the appearance of cooperation. Yet beneath the surface, a deadly rivalry was developing between two intelligent and ambitious individuals who understood that only one of them could ultimately control access to the king and influence over royal policy. Unlike the previous conflict with Gaveston, which had been primarily about emotional attachment and personal loyalty, the struggle with Despenser involved fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority and the distribution of political power. Despenser's methods of consolidating his control over Edward proved far more sophisticated than Gaveston's crude reliance on personal charm and martial prowess. The younger Despenser understood instinctively how to isolate potential rivals by controlling information flow, manipulating administrative procedures, and gradually expanding his formal authority within the government structure. His appointment as Royal Chamberlain provided him with the institutional power to regulate access to the king, effectively making himself the gatekeeper for all important political communications. Isabella found herself increasingly excluded from the private conversations where crucial decisions were made, relegated to ceremonial functions, while Despenser handled the practical business of government. This marginalization was particularly galling for a woman of her intelligence and political training, who had been raised in the sophisticated court of Philip IV and understood better than most the strategic thinking that effective governance required. Her exclusion from policy discussions represented not just a personal slight, but a fundamental misuse of her capabilities and connections. More personally humiliating was the evidence that Edward was once again developing the kind of intense emotional dependence on a male favourite that had characterised his relationship with Gaveston. Contemporary observers noted that the king seemed unable to make important decisions without consulting Despenser, that he showed obvious distress when separated from his favourite for extended periods, and that he displayed toward the younger Despenser the same kind of exclusive affection that had previously been directed toward the Gascon knight. The implications of this renewed favoritism were particularly troubling for Isabella because of Despenser's superior political skills and resources. Unlike Gaveston, who had been essentially dependent on royal favour for his position, Despenser possessed independent wealth and connections that made him a formidable opponent even without the king's support. His systematic expansion of his holdings in Wales and the Marches was creating a territorial power base that threatened to make him unassailable regardless of political changes at court. The personal dimension of Isabella's conflict with Despenser extended beyond mere political rivalry to encompass what appeared to have been genuine fears for her physical safety and that of her children. Contemporary sources suggest that Despenser regarded the Queen and her potential influence over the heir to the throne as threats to his own position that needed to be neutralized through whatever means proved necessary. The younger Despenser's ruthless treatment of other political opponents provided ample evidence of what he might be capable of if he decided that the royal family posed unacceptable risks to his continued dominance. The crisis in Isabella's relationship with both her husband and his favourite reached a new level of intensity during the Scottish campaigns of the early 1320s, when her personal safety was apparently compromised by what she saw as deliberate negligence on Despenser's part. The Queen's narrow escape from Scottish raiders at Tynemouth Priory in 1322, when she was forced to flee by sea while her household was attacked, convinced her that Despenser was either incompetent in providing for her protection or actively seeking to place her in danger. Edward's response to these incidents demonstrated his complete prioritization of Despenser's counsel over his wife's welfare and safety. Rather than investigating Isabella's complaints or taking steps to ensure her better protection, the king appeared to accept his favourite's explanations and excuses while showing little concern for the genuine terror that these experiences had caused his queen. This indifference to her welfare marked a crucial turning point in Isabella's attitude toward her marriage and her husband's fitness for kingship. The systematic dismantling of Isabella's household and the confiscation of her lands in 1324 represented the culmination of Despenser's campaign to neutralize her political influence and eliminate any potential threat to his dominance over royal policy. These actions, carried out with Edward's full approval and cooperation, removed the Queen's independent sources of income and political support, while placing her in a position of complete dependence on her husband's goodwill and Despenser's tolerance. The justification offered for these harsh measures, that Isabella's French birth made her a security risk during the ongoing conflict with France, was transparently pretextual and insulting to a woman who had served English interests faithfully for over 15 years. The real purpose was clearly to reduce the Queen to political insignificance, while demonstrating to other potential opponents the consequences of challenging Despenser's authority. Yet, in their triumph, Edward and his favourite had made a crucial miscalculation about Isabella's character and capabilities. Rather than accepting her marginalization with resigned submission, the Queen began to consider more radical measures to protect herself and her children while removing what she had come to see as an intolerable threat to both her personal safety and the kingdom's welfare. The woman who had once been Edward's most valuable political ally was slowly transforming into his most dangerous enemy, though neither the king nor his favourite appears to have recognized the deadly threat that their own actions were creating. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would prove far more destructive than any of the previous conflicts that had plagued Edward's reign. As Isabella's intelligence, political connections, and desperate fury combined to create the conditions for the most dramatic political upheaval in English medieval history. The Queen's growing hatred represented a far more sophisticated and ultimately more deadly threat than the crude military opposition that had characterized previous noble rebellions against royal authority. By the year 1321, the political tensions that had been building around Hugh Despenser the Younger's dominance over Edward II had reached a breaking point that would plunge England into its most serious internal conflict since the execution of Piers Gaveston nearly a decade earlier. Yet this new crisis would prove far more complex and destructive than the previous confrontation, involving not just personal animosity between the king and his nobility, but fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority, the rights of established noble families, and the proper distribution of power within the medieval English state. The immediate catalyst for what became known as the Despenser War lay in the younger Despenser's aggressive expansion of his territorial holdings in Wales and the Welsh Marches, a campaign of acquisition that had systematically dispossessed established landowners while concentrating unprecedented wealth and military power in the hands of the royal favourite. His methods had become increasingly brazen and legally questionable, involving the manipulation of courts, the intimidation of rivals, and the exploitation of his position as royal chamberlain to advance his personal interests at the expense of traditional property rights. The Welsh marcher lords who found themselves the targets of Despenser's acquisitive ambitions represented some of the most powerful and independent-minded nobles in the English realm. These families had built their wealth and influence through centuries of warfare against the Welsh princes, earning semi-autonomous status that allowed them to govern their territories with minimal interference from royal authority. Their ancient privileges and fierce independence made them natural opponents of any attempt to centralize power in the hands of a royal favorite, regardless of that individual's personal qualities or political abilities. Chief among Despenser's enemies were the Mortimer family, whose extensive holdings in the March had made them virtual princes in their own right for generations. Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, the head of this formidable clan, possessed both the military resources and the political connections necessary to organize effective resistance to Despenser's encroachments. His personal hatred for the royal favourite was intensified by family traditions that traced his lineage back to earlier conflicts with Despenser ancestors, creating a multi-generational vendetta that added emotional intensity to what might otherwise have been merely a political dispute. The crisis reached its initial climax in the spring of 1321, when Queen Isabella's attempt to visit Leeds Castle in Kent provided the spark that would ignite open warfare between the royal government and its noble opponents. The castle was held by Bartholomew de Badlesmere, one of the Marcher lords, who had become increasingly alienated from Edward's regime due to Despenser's policies. When Isabella arrived seeking accommodation, Lady Badlesmere refused her entry, precipitating a confrontation that would rapidly escalate into full-scale civil war. The Leeds Castle incident may have been deliberately orchestrated by Edward and Despenser as a pretext for military action against their opponents, or it may have resulted from genuine miscommunication and political miscalculation. Regardless of the original intentions, the royal response was swift and overwhelming, as Edward used the insult to his queen as justification for besieging the castle and demanding the surrender of all those responsible for the affront to royal dignity. The siege of Leeds Castle demonstrated both the potential effectiveness of royal military power when properly organized, and the dangerous precedent that such actions established for future political conflicts. Edward's forces quickly overwhelmed the garrison, capturing Lady Badlesmere and her children while executing 13 of the defenders as examples to other potential rebels. The brutal efficiency of this operation sent a clear message about the consequences of opposing royal authority, but it also convinced the marcher lords that compromise with Despenser's regime was no longer possible. The baronial response to the Leeds Castle incident revealed the extent to which opposition to Despenser had spread throughout the English nobility. Led by Thomas of Lancaster, whose vast wealth and royal connections made him the natural leader of any anti-government coalition, the rebels assembled a formidable military force that included some of the most experienced commanders in England. Their demands were initially moderate, calling for Despenser's exile rather than his destruction, but their willingness to resort to armed force demonstrated the depth of their alienation from Edward's regime. Edward's reaction to this baronial ultimatum revealed both his continued emotional dependence on Despenser's support and his fundamental misunderstanding of the political dynamics that were driving the crisis. Rather than attempting to negotiate a compromise that might have preserved both his favourite's influence and noble unity, the king chose to interpret the demands as a direct challenge to royal authority that required military suppression rather than political accommodation. The temporary exile of both Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father in August 1321 appeared to represent a victory for the baronial opposition, but it actually marked only a brief pause in what had become an irreconcilable conflict between competing visions of English governance. Edward's agreement to send his favourites away was clearly tactical rather than strategic, designed to buy time for military preparation rather than to resolve the underlying issues that had caused the crisis. The period of the Despenser's exile proved to be a crucial test of Edward's character and political skills, as he worked systematically to rebuild his position while preparing for the inevitable confrontation with his noble opponents. For once in his reign, Edward demonstrated genuine strategic thinking and political cunning, using the months of apparent submission to forge new alliances, secure military resources, and gradually isolate his enemies from potential sources of support. The king's success in rebuilding his position during the winter of 1321-22 revealed both his capacity for effective leadership when properly motivated and the fundamental weakness of the baronial opposition when deprived of clear justification for their actions. Edward's careful distribution of patronage and his willingness to make limited concessions on issues unrelated to the Despensers gradually won over moderate nobles who had initially supported the rebels' demands, but were uncomfortable with the prospect of prolonged civil war. More significantly, Edward managed to portray himself as the victim of baronial aggression rather than the author of the kingdom's troubles, a crucial shift in political perception that would prove decisive in the military campaigns that followed. By emphasizing his role as an anointed king, whose authority was being challenged by overmighty subjects, Edward tapped into deep-seated beliefs about the divine nature of royal power that resonated with nobles, who might otherwise have opposed his policies. The recall of the Despensers in early 1322 marked the beginning of the final phase of the conflict, as Edward felt sufficiently confident in his position to abandon the pretense of submission and move decisively against his enemies. The speed with which he restored his favourites to power and began military operations against the rebel strongholds demonstrated both his strategic planning during the period of apparent weakness and his determination to settle the conflict through force rather than negotiation. The military campaign that followed would prove to be one of the most successful of Edward's entire reign, as royal forces systematically reduced rebel positions while preventing their enemies from coordinating effective resistance. The king's decision to divide his opponents by attacking their strongholds simultaneously prevented them from concentrating their forces for a decisive battle, while his superior resources and central position allowed him to maintain the initiative throughout the campaign. The climactic confrontation came at the Battle of Boroughbridge in March 1322, where Thomas of Lancaster's attempt to join forces with Scottish allies was thwarted by the swift action of royal commanders who had positioned themselves to intercept the rebel army. The battle itself was brief but decisive, as Lancaster's forces were caught in an exposed position and overwhelmed by superior numbers and tactical coordination. Thomas of Lancaster's capture and subsequent execution marked not just the end of the Despenser War, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power between the English crown and its nobility. For the first time since his accession, Edward had demonstrated the kind of ruthless effectiveness that medieval kingship required, crushing his opponents through superior strategy and decisive action, rather than relying on political compromise or foreign intervention. Yet even in victory, Edward's character flaws would soon reassert themselves in ways that would ultimately prove more destructive than his previous failures. The systematic revenge that he and the Despensers inflicted upon their defeated enemies went far beyond what military necessity required, creating new sources of resentment, while demonstrating a vindictive cruelty that shocked even hardened political observers. The execution of Thomas of Lancaster was followed by a comprehensive campaign of persecution against all those who had supported the rebellion, involving mass confiscations of property, arbitrary imprisonments, and judicial murders that turned what should have been a moment of royal triumph into a reign of terror that alienated potential supporters while creating martyrs for future opposition movements. Hugh Despenser the Younger's behaviour during this period of unchecked power revealed the full extent of his ambition and ruthlessness, as he used the king's victory to eliminate personal enemies and acquire additional wealth on a scale that dwarfed even his previous acquisitions. His systematic abuse of legal processes to dispossess his opponents created a climate of fear among the nobility that would ultimately drive even Edward's natural supporters into opposition. The financial windfall that resulted from the confiscation of rebel properties provided Edward and his favourite with unprecedented resources, but it also demonstrated the essentially predatory nature of their regime. Rather than using this wealth to address the kingdom's pressing military and administrative needs, they devoted it primarily to personal enrichment and the construction of an elaborate system of patronage designed to maintain their political dominance. The period immediately following the Despenser War would prove to be the high water mark of Edward II's reign, representing his only sustained period of effective government and military success. Yet the methods he and his favourite used to maintain their position contained the seeds of their ultimate destruction, as their systematic abuse of power created enemies who would eventually find in Queen Isabella the leadership and international support necessary to destroy them. The victory at Boroughbridge had demonstrated that Edward was capable of decisive action when his personal interests were directly threatened, but it had also revealed his inability to govern with the moderation and wisdom that long-term political stability required. The king, who had seemed so weak and ineffective during the early years of his reign, had shown that he could be dangerous when cornered, but this strength came at the cost of alienating the very nobles whose support any medieval monarch needed to maintain effective authority. The stage was now set for the final act of Edward's tragedy, as the unchecked power that the Despenser War had placed in his and his favourites' hands would gradually corrupt them in ways that would make their eventual destruction both inevitable and deserved. The enemies they had crushed would be replaced by new and more formidable opponents, while their abuse of victory would gradually erode the legitimacy that even successful medieval kings required to maintain their authority over time. The diplomatic crisis that developed between England and France in the mid-1320s should have been a manageable challenge for Edward II's government. The kind of routine territorial dispute that had periodically strained Anglo-French relations for over a century without leading to fundamental political upheaval. Yet Edward's handling of this crisis would demonstrate once again his fatal tendency to subordinate the kingdom's broader interests to his personal attachment to Hugh Despenser the Younger, ultimately creating the conditions for his own destruction through the agency of the woman who should have been his most reliable ally. The immediate cause of the Anglo-French tension lay in the complex feudal relationships that governed Edward's holdings in southwestern France, where he ruled as Duke of Aquitaine under the nominal authority of the French crown. This arrangement had been a source of friction since the loss of Normandy over a century earlier, as English kings resented paying homage to their French counterparts, while French monarchs sought to expand their practical authority over territories they claimed as their feudal superiors. Isabella's brother, Charles IV of France, had proven to be a more aggressive and uncompromising monarch than his predecessors, determined to assert full French authority over Aquitaine, while reducing English influence in the region to purely ceremonial status. His demand that Edward appear in Paris to renew his homage for the duchy represented not just a diplomatic formality, but a fundamental challenge to English sovereignty that could not be ignored without serious consequences for royal authority. Yet Edward's response to this challenge revealed the extent to which his judgment had been compromised by his emotional dependence on Despenser's counsel and his obsessive fear of any separation from his favourite. Rather than travelling to France himself to resolve the dispute through direct negotiation with his brother-in-law, the king chose to send Isabella as his representative, apparently believing that her family connections would ensure a favourable outcome while allowing him to remain safely in England with his beloved advisor. This decision represented a catastrophic miscalculation that demonstrated Edward's fundamental misunderstanding of both the diplomatic situation he faced and his wife's character and capabilities. By sending Isabella to France, he was placing an intelligent and politically sophisticated woman in direct contact with potential allies who shared her growing alienation from his regime, while simultaneously providing her with the international platform and freedom of movement that effective opposition to his rule would require. Isabella's acceptance of this diplomatic mission marked the beginning of her transformation from marginalized queen to active conspirator, though initially she may have seen it simply as an opportunity to restore her political influence and repair her damaged relationship with her husband. The prospect of returning to the sophisticated French court where she had been raised, and of resuming contact with her powerful family members, must have seemed attractive after years of humiliation and isolation at Edward's court. The arrangement for Prince Edward to travel to France separately and perform homage on his father's behalf appeared to provide an elegant solution to the immediate diplomatic crisis, while avoiding the political risks that the king's personal appearance in Paris might have entailed. Yet this plan also placed the heir to the English throne directly under Isabella's influence at a crucial moment in his political development, creating opportunities for her to shape his understanding of the crisis that was engulfing his father's reign. Isabella's arrival in Paris in March 1325 marked her return to a political environment that appreciated her intelligence and diplomatic skills in ways that her husband's court had long since ceased to do. The warm reception she received from her brother and other members of the French royal family reminded her of the respect and influence she had once enjoyed, while also demonstrating the potential advantages that might result from a more decisive break with Edward's regime. The initial negotiations between Isabella and Charles IV proceeded smoothly, as the Queen's family connections and diplomatic experience enabled her to craft a compromise that addressed French concerns while preserving essential English interest in Aquitaine. Her success in these discussions demonstrated the value of the political skills that Edward had so consistently neglected, while also providing her with confidence in her ability to manage complex international relationships without male supervision or guidance. Yet even as Isabella achieved diplomatic success in her official capacity, she was simultaneously being exposed to a steady stream of criticism regarding her husband's governance and the destructive influence of Hugh Despenser the Younger. French court observers were well informed about English political developments, and they made no effort to conceal their contempt for Edward's favoritism or their sympathy for Isabella's personal sufferings under the Despenser regime. The arrival of Prince Edward in France in September 1325 provided Isabella with additional leverage in her dealings with both the French court and her increasingly desperate husband. The successful completion of the homage ceremony resolved the immediate diplomatic crisis, but it also left the Queen in possession of the heir to the English throne at a moment when her own relationship with Edward had deteriorated beyond any possibility of repair. Edward's increasingly frantic demands for his wife and son's immediate return revealed both his growing understanding of the trap he had created for himself and his continued inability to address the fundamental causes of their estrangement. Rather than offering meaningful concessions regarding Despenser's influence or Isabella's treatment, the king chose to rely on threats and emotional manipulation that only served to strengthen her resolve to remain in France until more substantial changes occurred. The Queen's public declaration that she would not return to England while Hugh Despenser the Younger remained in power represented a direct challenge to royal authority that transformed what had begun as a diplomatic mission into an open political confrontation. By framing her refusal in terms of personal safety rather than political ambition, Isabella skillfully positioned herself as a victim of tyrannical government rather than a rebellious wife, a narrative that resonated powerfully with contemporary observers. Charles IV's support for his sister's position provided Isabella with the international backing that any successful opposition to Edward's regime would require. The French king's willingness to protect her from her husband's demands while allowing her to establish an alternative political centre in Paris demonstrated the extent to which Edward's policies had damaged England's most important international relationships. The gradual assembly of English political exiles around Isabella's court in Paris created the foundation for what would eventually become a comprehensive alternative to Edward's government. These men brought with them detailed knowledge of English political conditions, military resources, and potential sources of support that would prove invaluable in planning the invasion that was already beginning to take shape in Isabella's mind. Yet perhaps the most significant development during this period was Isabella's encounter with Roger Mortimer, the exiled marcher lord whose dramatic escape from the Tower of London had made him a legendary figure among Edward's opponents. Their meeting would prove to be one of the most consequential personal relationships in English medieval history, combining romantic passion with political ambition in ways that would ultimately destroy Edward's reign and reshape the monarchy itself. The attraction between Isabella and Mortimer was both personal and political, as each possessed qualities that the other desperately needed for their respective struggles against the Despenser regime. Isabella provided Mortimer with access to international support and financial resources that his previous exile had lacked. while he offered her the military experience and ruthless determination that any successful rebellion would require. Their relationship also represented a fundamental violation of medieval social norms that added an element of personal scandal to what was already a serious political crisis. Isabella's adultery provided Edward and his supporters with powerful propaganda weapons, while also demonstrating her complete break with the conventional role of queen consort that had previously defined her political identity. As 1325 drew to a close, the diplomatic mission that had begun as an attempt to resolve a routine territorial dispute had evolved into the foundation for the most serious challenge to royal authority in English history. Isabella had successfully transformed herself from a marginalized queen into the leader of an international coalition dedicated to Edward's overthrow, while simultaneously gathering around her the military and political resources that would make such an ambitious undertaking feasible. The stage was now set for the final confrontation between Edward II and the woman who had once been his most valuable political asset, but had become his most dangerous enemy. The king's fatal decision to send Isabella to France had provided her with the opportunity and resources necessary to destroy him, demonstrating, once again, that his emotional dependence on Hugh Despenser the Younger had fatally compromised his judgment about the fundamental requirements of successful medieval kingship. The small fleet that departed from the harbours of Hainault on September 22nd, 1326, carried with it the hopes and fears of a generation of English political exiles who had spent years dreaming of return and revenge against the regime of Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger. Yet the invasion force that Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer had assembled was modest by any conventional military standard, consisting of no more than 1,500 mercenary soldiers and a handful of ships provided by Count William of Hainault as part of the marriage alliance between Prince Edward and his daughter Philippa. The decision to proceed with such a limited force reflected both the financial constraints that had hampered Isabella's preparations and her calculated assessment that political conditions in England had deteriorated to the point where even a small military intervention might trigger the collapse of her husband's increasingly unpopular government. Rather than attempting to overwhelm Edward's forces through superior numbers, the invasion strategy relied on the assumption that the king's subjects would welcome liberation from what many had come to see as a tyrannical and corrupt regime. Isabella's intelligence about conditions within England had been carefully gathered through networks of correspondence with sympathetic nobles and clergy who remained loyal to her cause despite their public submission to royal authority. These sources provided detailed information about the locations of potential supporters, the strength of royal garrisons at key strategic points, and most importantly, the depth of popular resentment against the Despenser regime that might be mobilized for political action. The selection of the Essex coast near Orwell as the invasion's landing site demonstrated the careful planning that had gone into this apparently desperate gamble. The location provided easy access to London while avoiding the heavily fortified positions that might have opposed a landing closer to the capital. More significantly, it placed the invasion force in a region where anti-government sentiment was particularly strong and where Isabella could expect to find immediate support from local nobles and gentry who had suffered under Despenser's administration. The invasion's initial success exceeded even Isabella's optimistic expectations, as the speed with which English nobles flocked to her banner demonstrated the complete collapse of popular support for Edward's government. Within days of the landing, the small mercenary force had been augmented by thousands of English soldiers whose willingness to join what was technically a rebellion against their anointed king revealed the depth of political alienation that the Despenser regime had created. Thomas of Norfolk, Edward's own brother, was among the first prominent nobles to declare for Isabella, bringing with him not only his personal military resources, but also the psychological impact of royal family division that further undermined Edward's claims to legitimate authority. His defection was quickly followed by Henry of Lancaster, brother of the executed Thomas and one of the most powerful landowners in northern England, whose support provided the invasion with both military strength and political legitimacy. The speed of these defections caught Edward's government completely unprepared for effective resistance, as years of ruling through fear and favoritism had left the king with few reliable allies and no coherent strategy for dealing with domestic rebellion. The systematic persecution that had followed the Despenser War had eliminated or alienated many of the military commanders and administrative officials whose loyalty might have been crucial in organizing resistance to the invasion. Edward's response to the crisis revealed both the panic that had seized his government and his continued inability to make the hard choices that effective leadership required. Rather than attempting to rally his remaining supporters for a determined defense of the capital, the king chose to flee westward with Hugh Despenser the Younger, apparently hoping to reach Wales, where they might find refuge among the marcher lords who had previously supported royal authority. This flight from London proved to be a catastrophic political mistake that transformed what might have been a manageable military crisis into the complete collapse of royal government. By abandoning the capital without a fight, Edward forfeited any claim to be effectively defending his kingdom, while simultaneously providing Isabella with access to the administrative machinery and financial resources that she needed to establish an alternative government. The popular uprising that erupted in London following Edward's departure demonstrated the extent to which urban opinion had turned against the Despenser regime. The mobs that rampaged through the city, seeking out and murdering royal officials who had been associated with unpopular policies, provided a grim preview of the violent reckoning that awaited those who had profited from the king's favoritism. Bishop Walter Stapledon, Edward's treasurer and one of Hugh Despenser's closest associates, became the most prominent victim of this urban violence when he was dragged from St. Paul's Cathedral and beheaded by an angry crowd that held him responsible for the financial oppression that had characterized the regime's later years. His death sent a clear message about the fate that awaited other government officials who remained loyal to the king. Isabella's decision to pursue Edward westward, rather than consolidating her control over London, demonstrated both her understanding of the psychological dimensions of political warfare and her determination to prevent any possibility of the king's escape to Ireland or continental Europe. By maintaining pressure on the royal party while they attempted to organize resistance, she ensured that Edward would have no opportunity to gather the resources necessary for a counterattack. The siege of Bristol marked a crucial test of Isabella's military capabilities and political strategy, as the city represented one of the last significant strongholds that remained loyal to Edward's government. Hugh Despenser the Elder, who commanded the garrison, was both a symbol of the regime's corruption and a valuable source of information about royal resources and plans that made his capture essential for the rebellion's success. The surrender of Bristol after a brief siege provided Isabella with both a strategic victory and an opportunity to demonstrate the fate that awaited those who continued to resist her authority. The execution of the elder Despenser, carried out with the brutal efficiency that medieval political justice required, sent a clear message about the consequences of loyalty to the fallen regime, while also satisfying the desire for revenge that motivated many of Isabella's supporters. The recovery of her daughters Eleanor and Joan from Despenser custody provided Isabella with a personal satisfaction that complemented the political advantages of her military success. The reunion with her children, who had been kept as virtual hostages to ensure her compliance with royal demands, marked the restoration of her maternal authority, while also providing visible symbols of the family unity that the Despenser regime had attempted to destroy. Edward's final desperate attempt to escape by sea demonstrated both his complete loss of control over events and his continued prioritization of personal safety over royal dignity. The king, who had once commanded one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, was reduced to fleeing across the Bristol Channel in a small boat, accompanied only by his favourite and a handful of loyal retainers who shared his fate as political fugitives. The weather conditions that forced Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger to return to the Welsh coast provided a fitting metaphor for the way in which circumstances beyond their control had conspired to destroy their carefully constructed system of power. Even nature seemed to be working against them, denying them the refuge that might have allowed them to regroup and organize more effective resistance. The final hunt for the royal fugitives through the mountains of South Wales took on an almost mythical quality, as the greatest king in Christendom was reduced to hiding in remote valleys, while his former subjects searched for him with the determination of men pursuing dangerous criminals. The transformation of Edward from sovereign ruler to hunted fugitive marked the complete reversal of the political order that had governed England for nearly 2 decades. The capture of Edward and Hugh Despenser near Llantrysant on November 16, 1326, brought to an end one of the most dramatic political upheavals in English medieval history. The king, who had begun the year as an apparently secure monarch, commanding vast resources and international respect, had been reduced to a prisoner in the hands of his own wife, a transformation that shocked contemporary observers throughout Europe. Isabella's triumph represented far more than a simple military victory over domestic opponents. She had successfully orchestrated the overthrow of an anointed king through a combination of political intelligence, international diplomacy, and military skill that demonstrated capabilities that few medieval women had ever been allowed to display. Her success would establish precedents for female political leadership that would influence English governance for centuries to come. Yet even in victory, the seeds of future problems were already evident in the methods that Isabella and Mortimer had used to achieve their success. The violation of royal authority that their rebellion represented, however justified by Edward's failures, established dangerous precedents for the resolution of political disputes through violence rather than negotiation. The precedent they had set would ultimately be used against them when Edward III came of age and decided to assert his own authority against his mother's regency. The invasion of 1326 had succeeded beyond Isabella's most optimistic expectations, but the ease of that success contained its own warnings about the fragility of medieval political authority and the speed with which even the most powerful rulers could fall when they lost the confidence of their subjects. The woman, who had been dismissed as a powerless exile less than 2 years earlier, had proven that intelligence, determination, and political skill could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles when combined with favourable circumstances and effective international support. The unprecedented political situation that confronted England in the early months of 1327 posed challenges that had no clear precedent in the entire history of medieval European monarchy. Never before had an anointed king been captured and held prisoner by his own wife, creating a constitutional crisis that tested the very foundations of royal authority and divine kingship that had governed Christian Europe for centuries. The solution that Isabella and Roger Mortimer devised would establish crucial precedents for the limitation of royal power, while demonstrating the political sophistication that had made their rebellion so successful. The decision to resolve Edward's fate through parliamentary proceedings, rather than summary execution, reflected both practical political calculations and genuine uncertainty about the legal mechanisms available for dealing with a deposed monarch. Isabella understood that any action taken against her husband would need broad legitimacy to be accepted by both English subjects and foreign observers, while the unprecedented nature of the situation required careful construction of legal justifications that could withstand critical examination. The Parliament that convened at Westminster in January 1327 was deliberately structured to ensure maximum representation from all segments of English society, creating a body whose decisions could be presented as reflecting the will of the entire kingdom, rather than merely the interests of a particular faction. The inclusion of representatives from cities and towns alongside the traditional noble and clerical participants demonstrated Isabella's understanding that effective political authority in 14th century England required popular support as well as elite acquiescence. The physical absence of Edward II from these proceedings created both practical difficulties and symbolic opportunities for those seeking to justify his removal from power. While tradition required the king's presence for valid parliamentary decisions, his refusal to attend could be interpreted as either justified defiance of an illegitimate assembly or contemptuous rejection of his subjects' legitimate concerns about royal misgovernment. The articles of accusation that were presented against Edward represented a comprehensive indictment of his entire reign, cataloguing not just specific instances of misrule, but fundamental failures in the basic responsibilities that medieval kingship entailed. The charges ranged from personal incompetence and submission to evil counsellors to more serious accusations of violating his coronation oath and bringing dishonour to the realm through military failures and diplomatic disasters. The accusation that Edward had lost Scotland through his own incompetence struck particularly deeply, as military success was considered one of the primary duties of medieval monarchy, and his father's reputation had been built largely on conquest and territorial expansion. The humiliating defeat at Bannockburn and the subsequent Scottish raids into northern England provided tangible evidence of royal failure that could not be explained away through political rhetoric or constitutional technicalities. Perhaps more damaging were the charges related to Edward's treatment of the English nobility, particularly his systematic persecution of those who had opposed the Despenser regime. The execution of Thomas of Lancaster and the broader campaign of revenge that had followed the Despenser War had violated traditional limitations on royal authority while creating a climate of fear that undermined the trust between crown and subjects that effective government required. The proceedings were carefully managed to create the impression of overwhelming popular support for Edward's removal, with representatives from London playing a particularly vocal role in demanding action against the failed king. The urban participants brought with them the anger of merchants and craftsmen who had suffered under the financial exactions and arbitrary government that had characterized the Despenser years, providing a populist dimension to what might otherwise have been seen as merely an aristocratic coup. The formal deposition of Edward II on January 13th, 1327, marked the first time since the Norman conquest that an anointed English king had been removed from power by his subjects, establishing a precedent that would haunt the monarchy for centuries to come. The ceremony was designed to emphasize the voluntary and consensual nature of the transfer of authority, with Edward III being proclaimed king through acclamation rather than inheritance, though the distinction was more symbolic than practical. The decision to crown Edward III immediately while his father still lived, created a unique situation in English constitutional history that required careful management to avoid the appearance of usurpation or illegitimate seizure of power. The new king's youth and obvious dependence on his mother's guidance provided reassurance that the real changes in the policy would be limited, while also ensuring that Isabella and Mortimer would retain effective control over government, despite the formal transfer of royal authority. The delegation sent to inform Edward II of his deposition represented an attempt to provide legal legitimacy for the proceedings, while also demonstrating the irreversible nature of the decision that had been taken. The choice of representatives from different segments of society reinforced the message that the entire kingdom had united in rejecting his continued rule, making any attempt at restoration both practically impossible and morally unjustifiable. Edward's response to the delegation revealed both the emotional devastation that his fall had caused and his belated recognition of the political realities that had made his removal inevitable. His tears and apparent acceptance of the decision were interpreted by contemporary observers as evidence of divine judgment against his misrule, though they might equally have reflected the psychological impact of complete political isolation and the loss of everything that had given his life meaning and purpose. The formal ceremony of abdication that took place at Kenilworth Castle represented the final act in Edward's transformation from sovereign ruler to private individual, a process that violated fundamental medieval beliefs about the permanent and sacred nature of royal authority. The breaking of his steward's staff of office provided a dramatic visual symbol of the end of his household's authority, while also demonstrating the ritual elements that medieval society required for such unprecedented political transitions. The speed with which Edward III's reign was officially dated from January 25, 1327, demonstrated the practical political considerations that drove the deposition process despite its constitutional complexities. The need to restore normal governmental functions and international relations required clear resolution of the succession question, regardless of the theological and legal difficulties that the deposition had created. The broader implications of these proceedings extended far beyond the immediate resolution of England's political crisis, as they established crucial precedents for the limitation of royal authority and the accountability of monarchs to their subjects. The principle that kings could forfeit their authority through systematic misgovernment would influence political thought throughout the later medieval period and provide justification for future challenges to royal power. Yet the very success of the deposition process contained the seeds of future problems, as the methods used to remove Edward II could potentially be employed against any monarch whose policies proved unpopular with powerful subjects. The precedent established in 1327 would be invoked during later political crises, contributing to the instability that would characterize English government throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. The Parliament of 1327 had achieved its immediate objectives of removing an ineffective king and establishing a new government that could command popular support, but it had also fundamentally altered the relationship between crown and subjects in ways that would have lasting consequences for English constitutional development. The principle of royal accountability that had been established through Edward's deposition would prove impossible to contain, creating expectations about monarchical behavior that would influence political relationships for generations to come. Isabella and Mortimer's success in managing this unprecedented constitutional crisis demonstrated their political sophistication and understanding of the symbolic and practical requirements that legitimacy demanded in medieval society. Yet their triumph also placed them in the dangerous position of having violated the most fundamental principles of medieval political order. making them potentially vulnerable to the same methods they had used so effectively against Edward II. The deposition had been accomplished with remarkable smoothness and apparent popular support, but the longer-term stability of the new regime would depend on its ability to govern more effectively than its predecessor, while avoiding the favoritism and arbitrary rule that had made Edward's removal both necessary and possible. The precedent they had established would ultimately be used against them when Edward III reached maturity and decided to assert his own authority against those who had exercised power in his name. The deposition of Edward II had resolved the immediate constitutional crisis that had paralysed English government, but it had also created new and potentially more dangerous problems regarding the fate of the former king, whose continued existence posed ongoing threats to the stability of the new regime. Isabella and Roger Mortimer found themselves in the unprecedented position of holding a deposed monarch, whose very survival could become a rallying point for future opposition, while his death would eliminate these risks at the cost of establishing even more dangerous precedents for the violent resolution of political disputes. The transfer of Edward from Kenilworth Castle to the more secure facility at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire during April 1327 reflected the growing concerns about plots to restore the former king to power. Despite his apparent acceptance of the deposition and his public renunciation of royal authority, Edward remained a powerful symbol for those who rejected the legitimacy of his removal or who hoped to exploit popular nostalgia for more stable times in their own political calculations. Berkeley Castle had been chosen for Edward's imprisonment because of its strong fortifications, its location in territory controlled by reliable supporters of the new regime, and most importantly, its distance from both London and the Scottish border, where rescue attempts might be more easily organised and executed. The fortress provided both the security that the former king's continued custody required and the isolation that would minimise his potential influence on contemporary political developments. The conditions of Edward's imprisonment appear to have been relatively comfortable by medieval standards, suggesting that Isabella and Mortimer initially intended to maintain him in indefinite but humane custody, rather than pursuing more violent solutions to the political problems his existence created. Accounts of his daily life at Berkeley describe a household maintained at considerable expense, with servants, luxury goods, and the kinds of accommodations appropriate for a nobleman of high rank, though obviously without the freedom of movement that might have allowed political activity. Yet even in comfortable captivity, Edward's presence continued to generate the kinds of political complications that made his existence problematic for the new regime. Reports reached Isabella and Mortimer of various conspiracies aimed at freeing the former king, some apparently organised by Dominican friars who had been members of his household, others involving former royal knights who retained personal loyalty to their deposed master, despite the obvious dangers such loyalty entailed. The most serious of these rescue attempts appears to have succeeded in breaking into Berkeley Castle itself. Though the conspirators were ultimately unable to complete Edward's liberation before being discovered and dispersed by the garrison. The success of this penetration of what should have been impregnable security demonstrated both the continuing loyalty that Edward inspired among certain segments of the population and the practical difficulties involved in maintaining indefinite custody of such a politically significant prisoner. The growing frequency and sophistication of these rescue attempts convinced Isabella and Mortimer that their original strategy of indefinite imprisonment was becoming unsustainable, as each successive plot increased the likelihood that one would eventually succeed, while also demonstrating to potential supporters that Edward's restoration remained a realistic possibility. The political stability that the deposition had been intended to achieve was being undermined by the continuing uncertainty about the former king's ultimate fate. The decision to move Edward between different locations in secret during the summer of 1327 reflected both security concerns and possible preparation for more permanent solutions to the problems his existence created. These mysterious transfers, conducted under cover of darkness and with minimal documentation, have provided fuel for conspiracy theories that continue to surround the circumstances of Edward's death, while also demonstrating the desperate measures that his captors were willing to employ to maintain control over his person. The official announcement of Edward's death at Berkeley Castle on the night of September 21st, 1327, came at a moment when the political pressures surrounding his imprisonment had reached crisis levels. The timing was, as historian Mark Ormrod has noted, suspiciously convenient for Isabella and Mortimer, resolving their most pressing political problem, while also eliminating the continuing security risks that Edward's survival had posed. The circumstances surrounding Edward's death have been the subject of intense historical debate for nearly 7 centuries, with scholars divided between those who accept the official account of natural causes and those who believe that murder was the most likely explanation for such conveniently timed demise. The lack of reliable contemporary medical records and the obvious political benefits that Edward's death provided to his captors have made definitive resolution of this question impossible. The most persistent alternative theory suggests that Edward was murdered through the insertion of a red-hot iron poker into his body, a method that would have been both excruciating and symbolically appropriate for a king whose alleged homosexual relationships had been used to justify his political destruction. This account first appeared in chronicles written several years after the supposed events and may have been influenced more by political propaganda than by factual reporting. Other theories have suggested various forms of suffocation or poisoning as more likely methods of murder, pointing out that these approaches would have been both more practical and less detectable than the dramatic torture described in the poker account. The medieval understanding of sudden death was limited enough that almost any method of murder might have been disguised as natural causes if properly executed. Perhaps the most intriguing alternative to the traditional account is the theory that Edward did not die at Berkeley at all, but was secretly removed from the castle and lived for many years in exile, while a substitute body was presented as evidence of his death. This theory, based primarily on the so-called Fieschi letter, written by an Italian priest in the 1340 S, suggests that Edward escaped with the connivance of his captors and eventually died as a hermit in Italy. The Fieschi letter provides a detailed account of Edward's supposed escape and subsequent wanderings that includes information about his imprisonment that appears to be accurate, leading some historians to take seriously its claims about his survival. According to this account, Edward was freed by a servant who killed the porter of Berkeley Castle and substituted his body for that of the king, allowing the real Edward to flee to Ireland and eventually to continental Europe. The credibility of the Fieschi letter remains a matter of scholarly debate, with some historians arguing that its accurate details about Edward's captivity suggest inside knowledge that might support its claims about his escape, while others contend that these same details could have been gathered through normal diplomatic channels without requiring direct involvement in any escape plot. The political implications of Edward's death, whether natural or violent, whether genuine or staged, were immediately beneficial to Isabella and Mortimer's regime in ways that strengthened suspicions about their involvement in whatever had actually occurred. The elimination of the continuing security risks and political complications associated with the former king's imprisonment allowed them to consolidate their authority, while also removing the possibility that Edward might become a martyr figure around whom opposition to their rule could organise. The funeral arrangements for Edward demonstrated both the new regime's desire to provide appropriate honours for the former king and their need to control the political symbolism that his death might generate. The decision to bury him at Gloucester Cathedral rather than Westminster Abbey reflected practical considerations about security and cost, but it also established what would become one of medieval England's most popular pilgrimage sites as stories of miracles at Edward's tomb began to circulate among the common people. The elaborate funeral ceremony that took place in December 1327 represented an attempt to provide closure for the dramatic events of the previous year, while also demonstrating the new government's respect for royal dignity despite their role in Edward's political destruction. The presence of Edward III at his father's burial provided important symbolism about the continuity of legitimate royal authority, while also allowing Isabella and Mortimer to display their own commitment to proper monarchical traditions. Yet even as Edward's body was laid to rest with appropriate ceremony, questions about the true circumstances of his death continued to circulate among contemporary observers who found it difficult to accept that such a conveniently timed demise could have resulted from natural causes. The former king's relatively young age and apparently adequate health made sudden death from illness seem improbable, while the obvious political benefits that his demise provided to his captors suggested more sinister explanations. The cult that gradually developed around Edward's tomb at Gloucester reflected both popular sympathy for his suffering and widespread skepticism about the official account of his death. Pilgrims who visited the site reported miraculous healings and other supernatural events that they attributed to the former king's intercession, creating a religious dimension to his memory that complicated Isabella and Mortimer's attempts to consign him to historical obscurity. The growth of this popular devotion to Edward's memory represented a significant political problem for the new regime, as it provided a focus for opposition sentiment, while also suggesting divine disapproval of the methods used to remove him from power. The emergence of Edward as a potential saint and martyr threatened to transform him from a failed king into a powerful symbol of resistance to tyrannical government, reversing the political narrative that had justified his deposition. Isabella and Mortimer's inability to prevent or control this development of popular devotion demonstrated the limitations of their political authority despite their apparent triumph over Edward's regime. The power to control events while Edward lived had not extended to controlling his reputation after death, and the former king's posthumous influence would prove to be one of the factors that ultimately contributed to the new government's own political difficulties. The continuing uncertainty about Edward's fate, whether he died naturally, was murdered, or somehow survived his imprisonment, has ensured that his story continues to fascinate historians and popular audiences nearly 7 centuries after the events at Berkeley Castle. The lack of definitive evidence about what actually happened on that September night has allowed each generation to interpret the events according to their own understanding of political power, royal authority, and the moral constraints that should govern the behavior of rulers toward their subjects. The mysterious circumstances surrounding Edward's death provide a fitting conclusion to a reign that had been marked throughout by uncertainty, controversy, and the collision between personal desires and political necessities. Whether he died as the victim of murder or as the beneficiary of escape, whether his end came through natural causes or human intervention, the former king's fate reflected the tragic consequences of the character flaws and political mistakes that had brought him to such a desperate situation. In the quiet chambers of Berkeley Castle, on a night when autumn winds swept across the Gloucestershire countryside, one of English history's most troubled reigns came to its enigmatic end. The man who had been born to rule one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms had died as a prisoner in the hands of his own wife, his legacy forever shadowed by questions about both his life and death that would never be fully resolved. The tragedy of Edward II's reign lay not simply in its violent conclusion, but in the waste of human potential and political opportunity that it represented. A king possessed intelligence, sensitivity, and genuine concern for his subjects' welfare had been destroyed by his inability to master the emotional dependencies and political favoritism that medieval kingship could not accommodate without fatal consequences. Piers. The death of Edward II, whether through natural causes or more sinister means, had eliminated the most immediate threat to Isabella and Roger Mortimer's continued dominance over English government, but it had also removed the primary justification for their extraordinary concentration of power in the hands of individuals who lacked legitimate claims to royal authority. As the crisis that had brought them to power receded into memory, the new regime found itself increasingly vulnerable to criticism of its methods and growing resentment of its policies. The 3 years of Isabella and Mortimer's regency that followed Edward II's death would prove to be marked by the same kinds of favoritism, financial extravagance, and political high-handedness that had characterized the fallen regime they had replaced. Despite their initial claims to represent reform and constitutional government, the practical exercise of power revealed that they were no more capable than their predecessors of governing within the traditional constraints that English political culture expected from its rulers. Isabella's transformation from wrong queen to effective regent demonstrated remarkable political skills, but it also revealed ambitions and appetites for wealth and power that gradually alienated the very nobles who had supported her rebellion against Edward II. Her accumulation of lands and income far exceeded what any previous queen consort had enjoyed, creating a personal power base that approached royal authority in everything but name, while also demonstrating a level of greed that shocked contemporary observers. The Queen's annual income, which reached the unprecedented sum of £13,333 through various grants and confiscations, made her one of the wealthiest individuals in England and provided her with the financial resources necessary to maintain an elaborate court that rivaled the king's own household in magnificence and political importance. This concentration of wealth in the hands of someone who was technically only the king's mother violated traditional expectations about the proper distribution of royal resources. Roger Mortimer's elevation to the newly created title of Earl of March in 1328 represented both a reward for his crucial role in overthrowing Edward II and a dangerous precedent for the creation of new noble titles based on political service rather than ancient lineage or royal blood. His assumption of quasi-regal authority, including the right to make major policy decisions without consulting other nobles, or even the young king himself, gradually created the same kinds of resentments that had destroyed previous royal favourites. The Regency's handling of Scottish policy proved to be particularly damaging to their political reputation, as their decision to conclude the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton with Robert the Bruce involved significant concessions that many English nobles viewed as unnecessary and humiliating. The formal recognition of Scottish independence and the payment of substantial compensation for previous English raids struck contemporary observers as evidence that the new government lacked both the military capability and political will to maintain English interests effectively. The marriage alliance between Edward III and Philippa of Hainault, while securing important international support for Isabella's regime, also represented a significant financial burden that required new taxation at a time when the kingdom was still recovering from the political and economic disruptions of the previous decade. The elaborate wedding celebrations that marked this union demonstrated the regenie's commitment to maintaining royal dignity, but they also revealed a level of extravagance that seemed inappropriate given the realm's financial difficulties. More troubling was the evidence that Mortimer was systematically accumulating lands and titles in ways that paralleled Hugh Despenser the Younger's earlier acquisitions, though with even less regard for legal niceties or the rights of existing landowners. His expansion of his holdings in Wales and the Marches involved the same kinds of questionable legal proceedings and economic coercion that had made the Despenser regime so unpopular, demonstrating that the new government was repeating the mistakes of its predecessor. The execution of Edmund, Earl of Kent, Edward II's half-brother, in March 1330, marked a crucial turning point in the Regency's political fortunes, as it demonstrated a level of vindictive cruelty that shocked even hardened political observers, while also eliminating a member of the royal family whose loyalty to the crown should have been beyond question. The circumstances surrounding this execution remain unclear, but it appears to have been motivated primarily by Mortimer's paranoid fears about potential threats to his authority. Edmund's crime appears to have been his involvement in plots aimed at freeing Edward II from imprisonment, though whether these conspiracies were based on accurate knowledge that the former king remained alive or simply reflected wishful thinking on the part of his supporters remains uncertain. Regardless of the specific details, the decision to execute a royal prince for such activities represented a dangerous escalation in the violence that the Regency was willing to employ against its opponents. The young Edward III's reaction to his uncle's execution marked the beginning of his personal opposition to the Regency that had governed in his name for the first 3 years of his reign. Despite his youth, the king was beginning to understand the political dynamics that had brought his mother and Mortimer to power, and he was increasingly resentful of their continued treatment of him as a mere figurehead whose opinions could be safely ignored in important policy decisions. The development of Edward III's political consciousness during 1330 reflected both his natural maturation as he approached his 18th birthday and his growing exposure to nobles who encouraged him to assert his own authority against those who had been ruling in his name. The birth of his son Edward, later known as the Black Prince, in June 1330 provided additional motivation for the king to secure his family's position by eliminating potential rivals for power and influence. The crisis that would ultimately destroy Mortimer's regime began to develop during the summer of 1330, as Edward III started to gather around himself a group of young nobles who shared his resentment of the Regency's continued dominance and his determination to assume personal control over royal government. These men provided both the military force and political legitimacy that any successful challenge to Isabella and Mortimer would require. The final confrontation came in October 1330, when Parliament was summoned to meet at Nottingham Castle, placing both Mortimer and Isabella in a location where Edward III could act against them with the support of loyal followers who had been positioned strategically throughout the fortress. The choice of Nottingham as the venue for this parliamentary session may have been intended to demonstrate Mortimer's continued authority, but it actually provided the king with the perfect opportunity to strike against his enemies. The coup that took place on the night of October 19th, 1330, demonstrated both Edward III's growing political sophistication and his understanding of the dramatic gestures that effective medieval kingship required. The secret entry into Nottingham Castle through underground passages the capture of Mortimer in his private chambers, and the dramatic confrontation with Isabella all provided the kinds of symbolic moments that would be remembered and discussed for generations to come. Isabella's reported plea to her son, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer," revealed both her emotional attachment to her lover and her recognition that the political relationship that had sustained them both was finally coming to an end. The Queen's appeal demonstrated the continuing power of maternal influence in medieval politics, but it also highlighted the fundamental conflict between personal loyalty and royal authority that had driven so many of the crises of Edward II's reign. Edward III's response to his mother's appeal demonstrated both his determination to assert royal authority and his understanding of the political necessities that his situation required. While he showed mercy to Isabella herself, allowing her to retire to comfortable exile rather than facing execution or imprisonment, his treatment of Mortimer was swift and merciless, reflecting the king's recognition that some threats to royal authority could not be tolerated regardless of personal relationships or previous services. The trial and execution of Roger Mortimer at Tyburn in November 1330 marked not just the end of an individual career, but the conclusion of an entire phase of English political development. The man who had risen from exile and obscurity to become the effective ruler of England had ultimately fallen victim to the same forces that had destroyed Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger, demonstrating the continuing instability of English political relationships and the dangers inherent in concentrating too much power in the hands of any single individual. Mortimer's death eliminated the last remaining figure from the dramatic events of the 1320s, clearing the way for Edward III to establish his own approach to kingship, free from the shadows of his father's failures and his mother's regency. The young king's successful assertion of personal authority marked the beginning of what would become one of the most successful reigns in English medieval history, though the lessons he had learned from observing the rise and fall of those who had preceded him would influence his political methods throughout his long career. The downfall of Isabella and Mortimer's regency represented both the end of an extraordinary period in English political history and the restoration of more traditional patterns of royal government under a king who understood the importance of avoiding the favoritism and arbitrary rule that had destroyed his predecessors. Yet the methods they had used to achieve and maintain power had established precedents that would continue to influence English politics for centuries to come, demonstrating both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in challenges to established royal authority. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of Edward II's troubled tale, a story that carries us gently through one of English history's most turbulent periods, while reminding us of the timeless human struggles that lie at the heart of all political drama. As you rest peacefully in the quiet comfort of your bed, perhaps you might reflect on the tragic figure of a king who possessed a gentle heart in an age that demanded iron will, whose greatest weakness was also his most human quality, his desperate need for love and companionship. Edward's story speaks to us across the centuries because it reveals the eternal tension between personal desires and public responsibilities, between the human need for affection and the isolating demands of power. In a world that expected its rulers to be as hard and unyielding as the stone walls of their castles, Edward remained stubbornly, tragically human. A man who loved too much, trusted too completely, and paid the ultimate price for his inability to master the cruel calculations that medieval kingship required. The relationships that defined Edward's reign, his passionate friendships with Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, his troubled marriage to Isabella, his conflicts with the nobility who demanded a different kind of leadership, all remind us that even kings and queens were, beneath their crowns and ceremonies, simply people struggling with the same emotions and needs that drive us all. Edward's tragedy was not that he felt these human impulses, but that his position made it impossible for him to satisfy them without destroying himself and others. Isabella's transformation from loyal wife to implacable enemy shows us how even the strongest bonds can be corrupted by the pursuit of power and the accumulation of grievances. Her story reminds us that revenge, however justified it might seem, often creates new cycles of violence and betrayal that extend far beyond the original injuries that inspired them. The she-wolf of France became a figure of legend, not because she was inherently evil, but because she allowed her legitimate grievances to harden into a hatred that ultimately consumed everyone it touched. As the gentle rhythms of sleep begin to carry you away from these medieval dramas, you might find comfort in knowing that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there were moments of genuine affection, loyalty, and love that transcended the brutal realities of political life. Edward's devotion to his friends, however misguided, reflected a capacity for deep emotional connection that speaks to something beautiful in the human spirit, even when that beauty became the instrument of destruction. The castle walls that witnessed these events still stand in many places across England, silent monuments to the hopes and fears of people long dead, whose struggles with power, love, and betrayal echo our own daily challenges in different forms. The stones of Berkeley Castle, Gloucester Cathedral, and Westminster Abbey have outlasted all the kings and queens who built them, reminding us that while political power is temporary, the human stories that unfold within these ancient walls possess a timeless quality that connects us across the centuries. Rest now, knowing that even the most turbulent times eventually give way to peace, that even the most bitter conflicts are ultimately resolved, and that the gentle passage of time has a way of healing wounds that once seemed impossible to bear. Edward II's reign ended in tragedy, but it also cleared the way for his son's more successful rule, demonstrating that even the darkest chapters in human history can serve a purpose in the larger story of human progress and development. Sleep peacefully, dear listener, and let the whispered echoes of these ancient stories carry you gently toward your own dreams, where the past and present merge in the timeless realm, where all human experiences become part of the great, continuing story of our shared humanity. In that quiet space between waking and sleeping, perhaps you'll find the same peace that eventually came to all these troubled souls, the peace that time and forgiveness can bring to even the most painful memories. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through one of history's most tragic reigns. Rest well, knowing that even in the darkest chapters of the past, there are lessons of humanity, frailty, and the eternal hope for redemption that tomorrow may bring. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams filled with the quiet wisdom that comes from understanding how our shared human story continues to unfold, generation after generation, in an endless cycle of love, loss, and renewal. Good night, gentle dreamer, and may the morning find you refreshed and ready for whatever story life will write for you next.